Chapter 23:30. As the great emperor began to speak, the aura of the cultivators in the hall surged, and their eyes revealed various expressions of enlightenment. Their cultivation foundation was also unknowingly changing, gradually becoming one with the world. The world's yuan qi was like rivers flowing into the sea, constantly pouring into their bodies. At this moment, the hall where the monarch was seemed to have turned into a boundless black hole that began to devour all the origin energy of the world. Looking up from the ground, it was as if a huge hole had suddenly appeared in the sky, and everything in the world began to flow out of the hole. This sudden change left all the living beings in this world, who did not have the right to enter the hall, dumbfounded. They were envious of what the experts who could enter the hall had gone through, but they were also sorrowful that they did not have the right. In fact, there were even some jealousy and other negative emotions in their hearts. The entire world fell into a strange atmosphere. It seemed like a storm was coming, but it also seemed like the darkest moment before dawn. At some point in time, living beings soared into the sky one after another, converging towards the supreme palace from all directions. However, that palace was extremely mysterious. Even if it wasn't like Luo Fan's palace, which could hide between reality and illusion and not be detected by any living being, it was still not a place that ordinary living beings could approach. No matter how hard those living beings tried, no matter how accurate their aim was, no matter how many billions of light years they flew, they could only get close to the hall to a point where they could barely see it. No matter how hard they tried, they could not get close to the hall, let alone enter it. Therefore, as time passed, more and more cultivators gathered in a certain area a certain distance away from the palace. However, the palace was still the same as before, still crazily absorbing the world yuan qi of the world. It was still like a huge whirlpool. There were not many cultivators who chose to approach the hall. However, the number of cultivators in this world was simply too great. Even if only 1 in 10 million cultivators chose to approach the hall, the number of cultivators gathered around the hall had unknowingly reached an unimaginable scale. Such a large gathering of cultivators covered the sky above the hall. Several years later, when people looked up, they could no longer see the hall that seemed to have turned into a black hole and was devouring everything. At this moment, when he raised his head, he could only see a patch of dark clouds hanging strangely in the sky, constantly surging and changing. They couldn't even get close to this palace. Even if some living beings were filled with hatred and wanted to destroy this palace, it was impossible for them to do so. As a result, even though the palace had been the target of countless living beings for so many years, it still quietly hung there, as if nothing had happened. It continued to absorb the endless yuan qi of the world at a steady pace, gathering the endless mysteries behind the world. However, even though they were unable to break into the palace by force, the countless cultivators that had gathered in the distance did not come out empty-handed. If they really didn't gain anything, then how could they have stayed here for so many years? After all, without the suppression from the quasi-saints and the other higher-ups, they could roam the world freely, and they could even take the countless resources that they didn't have the qualifications to obtain. Under such a good environment, how could they waste time staying here if they didn't gain anything? Why would they waste time surrounding the hall? As a matter of fact, they had been receiving a great deal of benefits all these years while they were surrounding the palace. The source of these benefits was none other than the endless origin energy of the world that was gathered by the hall and the endless mysteries hidden behind the world. To all cultivators who had attained the first heaven realm, the origin energy of the world didn't mean much to them. Because once one attained the innate golden immortal realm, any cultivator was already capable of being self-sufficient, and so long as they were willing, they could obtain as much as they wanted. However, to those cultivators who hadn't attained the first heaven realm, the endless origin energy was obviously an extremely precious existence. Every bit of origin energy was able to reduce the amount of time they needed to cultivate. At this moment, the endless origin energy that was converging madly from all directions was equivalent to a cultivation accelerator for them. Obviously, besides first heaven realm cultivators, there was a large portion of cultivators that hadn't attained the first heaven realm that were gathered here. After all, the first heaven realm cultivators that possessed true potential and were looked upon favorably had entered the hall and were listening to the lecture with the few dozen quasi-saints. Even though there were first heaven realm cultivators that remained outside, they weren't all of them. Moreover, this was merely the benefits that the origin energy of the world brought to them. Besides the origin energy of the world, the endless mysteries hidden behind the world that were converging ceaselessly from all directions were countless times more precious than the origin energy of the world. It was even to the extent that the value of the origin energy of the world didn't differ according to the origin energy of the world. In other words, no matter if it was to first heaven realm cultivators or non-first heaven realm cultivators, the gathered profundities were equally precious and useful. This was the main reason why countless cultivators were gathered here and refused to leave. However, even though numerous cultivators were gathered here, the origin energy and profundities that they could come into contact with were obviously different according to the difference in their distance from the hall and the angle of the hall. Such differences naturally caused the cultivators that were gathered here to compete with each other. As a result, battles naturally occurred in the gathering places of these cultivators. Even though they knew that this was a rare opportunity to gain enlightenment, they still wasted most of their time on these battles. Practically every single place with a beautiful environment was constantly being fought over, and in the end, it caused the utilization rate of those places to be much lower than other places. However, such a change was human nature. It was the after-effect of so many years of battles. Even if the quasi-saints were here to suppress it, they might not be able to completely suppress it. Moreover, the quasi-saints had already entered the hall to listen to the truth, so none of them were in the outside world to suppress these conflicts. As a result, in this place where many cultivators were gathered, the number of cultivators who died was even higher than when the war was still going on. A subtle chaos was constantly brewing, causing the world to be unable to return to its original state before the various camps were formed. No one in the hall paid any attention to the situation in the outside world. Those who were listening to the truth were trying their best to absorb the content of the Emperor's words, trying their best to fuse all the principles and profundities contained in the Emperor's words into their bodies as much as possible. They were trying their best to convert everything into their own gains, and convert it into a new foundation for their cultivation. In this way, they even wished that they could pay thousands of times more attention to the Emperor out of thin air. How could they spare any energy to pay attention to the situation outside the hall? Not to mention that they had the resolve to sacrifice themselves for others. The hall itself was also their biggest obstacle. It was enough to completely isolate them from the outside world, making it difficult for them to discover any changes in the outside world. If the cultivators who were listening to the Emperor's words were like that, the Emperor who was preaching the Emperor wasn't any better. To the Emperor, everything he was preaching was not only for the cultivators below to listen to, but also for himself. After all, his countless comprehensions were obtained from the world and the mist at the end of the world. Although they all belonged to him now, the method of obtaining them was still too easy and simple. Through this method of obtaining them, his own comprehension of these profundities still couldn't reach the acme of perfection. There was still a gap between what he comprehended out of thin air and what he comprehended out of thin air bit by bit. Under such circumstances, preaching to the many cultivators at this time was equivalent to comprehending these profundities bit by bit from the beginning. This was obviously a great help to him in mastering these profundities. It could be said that with every bit of truth he preached, his foundation was becoming more solid. Every time a cultivator understood the essence of the truth he preached, it was equivalent to him mastering a bit of the truth himself. In this way, how could he waste time paying attention to the situation in the outside world? How could he pay attention to the methods the cultivators in the outside world used to fight for a place close to the hall? How much price and how many sacrifices were made in the process? During this process, time passed bit by bit. Unknowingly, 300 years had passed for the outside world. These 300 years seemed very long. At least, for the living beings on the ground who didn't go close to the hall and absorb the endless essence chi and profundities gathered by the hall, this was the case. After all, to them, there had been innumerable bombs hovering above the void over the past 300 years, twisting and brewing at every moment as if they could explode at any moment and drag the world into the abyss of despair. To them, the war that happened on a higher plane was the abyss of despair. For the cultivators in the palace, 300 years had passed in the blink of an eye. When the great monarch stopped preaching, indicating that this was the end of the preaching, they were filled with a strong reluctance to leave. They shouted loudly, "Thank you, Emperor, for teaching me the truth." At this time, they were still in a daze and couldn't recover from the content of the Emperor's preaching in the past 300 years. Compared to before, the current great Emperor seemed even more unfathomable. The omniscient, and omnipotent aura that lingered around him was even more intense. At first glance, all the cultivators felt that all their secrets had been seen through by the Emperor. All their insights and thoughts seemed to be meaningless in the Emperor's eyes. Even though they had made unimaginable progress compared to 300 years ago, they still felt the same. This change made them realize that the distance between them and the Emperor had not shrunk after listening to the Emperor's preaching for 300 years. On the contrary, it had become even wider. This made them feel even more shocked. After all, compared to 300 years ago, they had made so much progress that even they couldn't believe it. First of all, the number of sage-to-be had increased by several times compared to 300 years ago. The original number of sage-to-be had increased from dozens to nearly 200. Secondly, the strongest sage-to-be, who was originally only a minor sage-to-be, had unknowingly surpassed the intermediate realm and the great realm, and reached the peak sage-to-be. Apart from that, the other cultivators had at least improved by a small realm, and some had even improved by 5 or 6 realms. They had directly become sage-to-be from innate grand luo. In the past, they even suspected that it would take them millions or even tens of millions of years to achieve such progress. But now, not only had they made such progress in the past 300 years, but they also felt that the strength they could exert had made a qualitative leap compared to before. It was not just in terms of power but also in terms of efficiency. If it was purely in terms of power, it was not surprising at all that they could exert more power than before with the improvement of their cultivation realms. Now, the reason why they regarded this effect as an extraordinary improvement was because the efficiency of their utilization of strength had increased by countless times. It could be said that now, they only needed one portion of power to exert the effect that they needed hundreds or even thousands of portions of power to exert in the past. Even so, they still felt that the gap between them and the Emperor had widened. How could they not be shocked by this situation? How could they not be shocked by the Emperor's power? The Emperor did not care about the cultivators' reluctance to part with him at this moment. He just said indifferently, "The preaching is over. You may leave now." As he spoke, the door of the hall opened, revealing the scene that they had neglected for hundreds of years in the outside world. All the cultivators bowed to the Emperor and thanked him again. Then, they turned around and left respectfully. Chapter 23:31. What do you have to say? The great monarch waited for everyone to leave before asking the peak quasi-sage cultivator. Hearing this, the peak quasi-sage cultivator looked worried and asked, "May I ask the great monarch if teacher of the source of the method has any instructions?" Hearing this, the great monarch's expression changed greatly. It was as if he had heard something that toppled his worldview. He was completely stunned. Seeing this, the pinnacle quasi-sage cultivator couldn't help but feel astonished. After all, the great monarch's performance had completely exceeded his expectations. Before the great calamity of the world, the source of the method had preached the path of cultivation to all living beings without any restrictions. It had imparted countless cultivation methods and awakened all living beings. It could even be said that without the source of the method, it was unknown whether the world could survive the last great calamity of the world. Under such circumstances, the great monarch had said that their previous cultivation path had strayed off course and publicly announced that he was cultivating the true path. This was almost certain that the great monarch had some kind of communication or even trade with the source of the method that they did not know about. Because of this, the great monarch had stayed and asked this question. However, looking at the great monarch's current appearance, things seemed to be different from what he had imagined. All sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind, but the peak quasi-sage cultivator's expression did not change at all. He only looked at the great monarch with just the right amount of doubt. At this moment, the great monarch's heart was in turmoil. Countless information, countless thoughts, countless doubts, and countless fears emerged from the bottom of his heart. His entire heart felt like it was tightly gripped by something extremely terrifying. It was as if every breath he took required all of his strength. In the end, he muttered, "Teacher of the source of the method. Teacher of the source of the method." As he said this, the peak quasi-sage cultivator felt an indescribably terrifying power crash into his body. With a loud rumble, his entire body instantly crumbled and turned into dust. A gust of wind blew him out of the hall. Fortunately, the terrifying power just now did not erase his soul, nor did it completely obliterate the power and divine ability he grasped. The method of shattering his body seemed brutal, but it was equivalent to changing the appearance of water out of thin air. The damage to his body was rather limited. Therefore, after leaving the palace, the cultivator at the peak of the sage-to-be realm gathered his will and reappeared in the void, appearing in front of the cultivators who had just left. After recovering, the expression of this peak sage-to-be cultivator kept changing. It seemed that he wanted to get angry but lacked the courage to do so. He wanted to fly into a rage but lacked the courage to do so. After a while, he took a deep breath and suppressed his anger. He turned to the other cultivators who happened to be looking at him curiously and said, "Fellow Taoists, don't worry. The great emperor is not very angry. Otherwise, I would not have the chance to recover." He naturally knew that it was impossible for those cultivators to care about him. Those cultivators were obviously more concerned about whether the great emperor, who seemed to be angry and threw him out of the palace just now, was still angry and whether he would attack them. Therefore, he didn't flatter himself by talking about himself. Instead, he directly stated his conjecture about the great emperor. His behavior made those cultivators all heave a sigh of relief. One by one, they reluctantly expressed a little bit of concern for him. After that, they all went their separate ways, heading to various parts of the world to their respective territories. As for the new situation in this world, it was obvious that many cultivators needed to compromise and understand each other according to the situation in their respective places. It was naturally not necessary to discuss it here. As for the countless cultivators who had gathered around when they were listening to the truth in the palace, they had already dispersed when the strange phenomenon in the palace disappeared. Therefore, at this time, there were only the 3,000 cultivators who were listening to the truth in the palace. This saved them a lot of trouble. Let's not talk about how the 3,000 cultivators would compromise and understand each other after returning to their own places. Let's talk about the great emperor alone. At this moment, the great emperor's emotions were extremely chaotic, and he felt extremely uncomfortable. At this moment, he faintly felt that there seemed to be a huge shadow behind him that was shrouding him. This shadow was so terrifying that just thinking about it made him tremble. Why did I suddenly forget about him? What kind of power made me completely unable to remember Teacher's existence? At the end of the day, all the questions he had turned into this question. Now that he was already a false sage of this world, if he was willing, nothing in this world could be hidden from him. all the secrets that existed in this world would be completely open to him. At this moment, his heart moved slightly. His perception directly penetrated the endless distance, the countless barriers of time and space, the barriers of rules and laws, and even the misdirection of the great Tao. He directly arrived at the place where he had stayed for a long time, the place that was between the real and the fake. What he saw there was only a blurry, indistinct palace. As for the aura of the palace, the sense of familiarity that it gave him, as well as the aura that he sensed when he first came to this place that was between real and fake, did not exist at all. It was as if it was just an afterimage of the palace that his teacher, the source of the method, had left there. This is really bad. At this moment, this was what appeared in the great emperor's mind. In front of other cultivators, he felt like he was in control of everything and could crush them all. In fact, when he thought of his teacher, the source of the technique, he was shocked, worried, and panicked. However, in his heart, he had a feeling that he was on par with him now, and perhaps he could even defeat him now. However, now that he came into contact with the palace that was between the real and the fake, he realized that the gap between him and his teacher, the source of the method, had not only not shrunk, but it had also greatly increased. It was the same feeling that the quasi-saints felt when they saw him, since the great emperor was able to take on the heavy responsibility of leading the world during the disaster. He was clearly not a coward. At this moment, although the situation seemed to be so bad that it could not be salvaged, he did not lack the will to solve it. He did not have the intention to escape either. In that instant, a thought flashed through his mind. He stood up and took a step forward. His figure had already entered the void, entering the realm that existed between reality and illusion. He quickly headed towards the location of the palace that seemed to have turned into an illusory afterimage. It didn't take long for him to arrive outside the palace. Just like what he sensed before, the palace was still as illusory as before. He could not even see the palace, let alone enter it to meet Luo Fan. The great emperor had expected this to happen. With a thought, he knelt before the palace and begged Luo Fan to forgive his mistake and grant him a meeting. His begging was extremely sincere, and his attitude was as humble as it could be. Compared to his current attitude, the attitude that the quasi-saints and innate Grand Luo realm cultivators had when they met before could be considered arrogant. Several days later, a sigh was heard by the great emperor. Hearing the sigh, the eyes of the great emperor, who had been sincerely begging for several days, lit up. He felt an indescribable excitement rising from the bottom of his heart. At that moment, he began to beg even more earnestly. Although he did not cry, it was still extremely touching, and one could not help but be moved. At this moment, the palace that was originally like an afterimage began to become clearer and more real. It didn't take long for it to return to its original appearance. It was completely presented in front of the great emperor. Immediately after that, the door to the hall opened with a rumble, and a boundless and deep starry sky appeared. "I'm still too far away from teacher." At that moment, such a thought appeared in the great emperor's heart. When he compared the interior of the palace before him to the interior of the palace that he had created before, he knew that the interior of the palace before him was worlds apart from the one before him. It could even be said that comparing the two together was an insult to the starry sky before him. The interior of his palace was merely an ethereal and transcendent atmosphere that he had casually created. However, the starry sky before him was not only vast and boundless, but every single star in it was also real. In fact, when he focused his gaze, he could even see countless living beings living within the countless stars. In other words, the starry sky before him seemed to be just a background that his teacher, the origin of technique, had casually created at first glance. However, the actual situation was that it was a complete universe that was truly perfect. There were even laws, the river of time and space, and some sort of Tao within it. Compared to the ethereal and transcendent atmosphere of the palace that he had casually created, it was naturally much higher. He walked forward devoutly and soon saw Luo Fan, who was sitting in the middle. He saw the supreme existence that seemed to be the core of the entire universe. Compared to what he had seen before, Luo Fan was still the same as before. Even his movements seemed to have not changed at all. So I've only learned a drop in the ocean back then. At that moment, this thought appeared in the great emperor's heart out of nowhere, making him feel even more reverent. Luo Fan naturally knew what the great emperor was thinking. At that moment, he said, "It seems like you've really remembered me." Hearing this, the great emperor hurriedly knelt and apologized. "I don't know why, but I was muddle-headed back then and completely forgot about teacher. I only remembered when someone reminded me. This is really strange, and I can't tell you about it," he then explained. Hearing this, Luo Fan nodded calmly and said, "I already know the reason." The great emperor's eyes lit up when he heard this. He hurriedly knelt again and begged Luo Fan to give him an answer. Luo Fan shook his head and said, "It's not the right time yet. I'll tell you the next time we meet. Knowing too much now won't help. Instead, you'll get into trouble." The great emperor was rather unwilling to accept this. The answer was right in front of him, but he could not find out because he was being obstructed. One could imagine how torturous it was. If it had been before, he would definitely have listened to Luo Fan's arrangements and cast the matter aside. However, at that moment, he felt the urge in his heart growing stronger. His desire for the answer to the question was expanding like crazy. In just a short while, his desire for the answer had grown so strong that he could no longer suppress it. It had directly overpowered his rationality. If he was still in that calm state, perhaps he would know that something was wrong with his current situation. However, it was obvious that his rationality had been overwhelmed by the desire. At that moment, all he could think about was to dig out the answer from Luo Fan's mouth. He had cast everything else to the back of his mind. Therefore, he knelt down and kowtowed to Luo Fan. He could not stop begging, hoping that Luo Fan would tell him the answer to his question. He was willing to bear all the consequences of his actions and pay any price that he had to pay. If anyone else saw the great emperor behaving like this in front of Luo Fan, they would definitely have their worldview overturned. They would suspect that the person before them was purposely created by Luo Fan to tarnish the great emperor's image. Faced with such a great emperor, Luo Fan's expression did not change. He merely asked calmly, "Are you really willing to bear all the consequences of your actions? Pay any price that you have to pay?" The great emperor's fervent eyes suddenly lit up. He could not help but nod to express his absolute willingness. Luo Fan asked again, "Even if this may subvert your worldview and cause your cultivation path to be cut off from now on, and you may never have the chance to improve again, will you still not change your mind?" A hint of struggle flashed through the great emperor's eyes, but a hint of clarity flashed through them. However, the struggle and clarity ultimately could not overcome the endless fervor and endless desire that surged from the bottom of his heart. In the end, it was completely washed away by the fervor, causing his eyes to regain their previous fervent look. Seeing that, Luo Fan did not persuade him anymore. He said, "If that's the case, I'll tell you the answer. I only hope that you won't regret it." "Teacher, please say it. Even if I die and my soul scatters after hearing it, I won't have any complaints towards teacher," the great emperor vowed. Hearing this, Luo Fan only said, "You can naturally say anything now. You'll only know the final outcome after I'm done." Chapter 2332. The reason why you would forget about me and suddenly have such a huge improvement is because of you. The root cause is that you resonated with your source when you were at the end of the world, at the boundary between the world and the chaotic state. Luo Fan explained the root cause of the emperor's various changes calmly. These words caused the martial monarch's expression to change dramatically. His heart was filled with fear, but there was still a hint of confusion deep in his eyes. It was obvious that he felt extremely uneasy from the words that he heard from Luo Fan. However, it was obvious that he could not completely understand the meaning behind Luo Fan's word. That was why he was at a loss now. Source? Resonance? He muttered as his three eyes looked at Luo Fan. There was doubt, confusion, and fear in his eyes. His body, which had not sweated in a long time, started to break out in cold sweat. He had a premonition that what his teacher, the origin of the technique, was going to say next would topple his worldview. It would cause his original understanding of the world and his understanding of himself to undergo a tremendous change. Rationally, he wanted to stop Luo Fan and stop him from continuing. But emotionally, he was incomparably eager for Luo Fan to explain to him what he was going to say next. Even if he had to pay with his life, he would not hesitate. Since Luo Fan had already decided to tell her, he naturally could not give up halfway. He said indifferently, "I think you should have sensed the strangeness of this world." Now, the great Tharch had already become a false saint. Moreover, he had perfectly merged with this world, almost becoming a part of this world. As such, he definitely had a perception of the state of the entire world that surpassed that of ordinary cultivators. Even though the world was created by his sixth great calamity, even the appearance of the born Taoism aptitude was completely replicated. It was already extremely detailed and perfect. However, after all, it was not a world created by a true divine stage existence in the state of chaos. For ordinary cultivators, the slight difference during this period might not be enough to let them know, nor would it be enough to make them feel uncomfortable. However, to the false saint who had already merged with heaven and earth, the extremely tiny disharmony was as obvious as a black dot on a piece of white paper. Of course, perhaps with his experience, his understanding of cultivation, the primal chaos and tribulations, he was unable to describe this anomaly. However, he was definitely able to sense it. Hearing this, the great monarch's face was filled with shock. He had never shown this strange feeling in any situation before. In fact, he wasn't even sure if this feeling was real. Was it just an illusion, or was there really something abnormal? Previously, he even had the thought of spending some effort to find the answer to this question. However, he didn't expect that his teacher, who was the source of the technique, would be able to point out his feelings so straightforwardly. From the looks of it, it was as if this abnormality was a matter of course. How could he not be shocked and aghast? "This disciple has the same feeling," he said with some doubt. Luo Fan said expressionlessly, "That's what you feel. In fact, this world was created by a certain existence for a certain purpose, using a perfect world that existed in the state of chaos as a template. The great Tao, rules, and nomological laws in this world were all copied from that world. In other words, everything could be found in that part of the world, the source. Do you understand now?" When the great monarch heard this, he was stunned. The first thing that appeared on his face was disbelief and rejection. Immediately after, his gaze changed, as if he had thought of many things that had happened in the past or comprehended something. The disbelief and rejection gradually disappeared. Not long after, he turned into ashes, and there was an indescribable despair in his three eyes. No matter what, he was a false saint, so how could he not know what Luo Fan meant? The great Tao, rules, and nomological laws in this world all had a source, and his previous improvement and forgetfulness had resonated with his source. Didn't that mean that he was actually just a copy of a certain living being? In that case, how much of his life, his personality, the realizations and feelings that appeared at certain times, and even the countless information, mysteries, and realizations that he had obtained out of nowhere, how much of it truly belonged to him? Or could it be that all of this was just a fixed process that had always been carried out in a fixed manner and order? All sorts of complicated and messy thoughts kept emerging from the bottom of his heart. Not long after, his spirit was completely drowned, causing his entire body and mind to fall into a violent storm. He could no longer control himself. From the outside, it looked like the power in the great emperor's body had begun to surge rapidly. The infinite power contained in his body surged wildly, constantly shattering the surrounding space-time. It even vaguely affected the endless stars within a certain range, causing countless stars to be completely wiped out in an instant, forming a true vacuum that was getting wider and wider. The supreme, omniscient, and omnipotent feeling that the great emperor originally had started to waver. It became faintly discernible, sometimes much stronger than before, and sometimes completely disappearing. It looked as if his false saint realm had started to waver and was gradually becoming unstable. All of this is fake. Suddenly, he let out a loud roar. As he roared, his body suddenly exploded. All of his power broke through the limits of his body and started to rush in all directions, causing the surrounding spacetime to collapse continuously. The entire palace, or rather, the universe inside the palace, started to shake crazily at this moment. It was as if it had turned into a reflection in the water and was being stirred crazily by some invisible power. If Luo Fan wasn't here, no matter how vast this universe was, it would definitely fall into doomsday in an instant. Everything would be completely destroyed under the terrifying impact of the false saint realm power. However, this situation obviously did not happen. At this moment, Luo Fan was still in this universe, still in front of this great emperor. At this moment, he didn't even make any movements. With just a thought, a power that could freeze everything swept across the entire universe, directly suppressing the terrifying power that was crazily destroying this universe. The level of this power was extremely high, and it was definitely fatal to ordinary quasi-saints or even false saints. However, to Luo Fan, it was just a power that he had grasped before. It couldn't be any easier for him to suppress it. In just an instant, the entire universe had completely frozen. The body of the great emperor, who was constantly collapsing and being destroyed, also stopped at the same time. Although the power was still spreading in all directions, it was no longer able to affect anything in the surroundings. It felt as if the power had turned into a breeze. At this time, the great emperor slightly sobered up because the impact of the power had become gentle. He looked at Luo Fan with eyes full of complex emotions. There seemed to be some fear, some expectation, some regret, and some sudden realization, as well as some indescribable resentment. Luo Fan sighed and said, "Sure enough, I knew it would be like this." At this moment, the great emperor's eyes were filled with intense pain as he let out a loud roar. "Disciple regrets it." As he spoke, his entire body seemed to be made of smoke. With a slight shake, he dissipated in all directions, only a faintly discernible imprint was left. It shot out of the hall and directly broke through all the barriers in the hall. It entered the perfect life cycle in the outside world, entering his next reincarnation. This was Luo Fan's hall. If he wanted to, he could definitely stop the imprint. However, at this moment, he only quietly watched the mark go through reincarnation and did not take any action. "I hope you'll be able to regain your true self after reincarnation," thought Yi Futian as he watched the imprint gradually disappear. Following that, he turned his gaze and looked at the entire world outside. He saw all the cultivators in the outside world. With a thought, the situation of these countless cultivators flashed through his mind. In the eyes of ordinary cultivators, this kind of action of seeing hundreds of millions of cultivators in the entire world was naturally inconceivable, but for Luo Fan, this was an almost instinctive ability, and it was not even worth him spending the slightest bit of attention on it. After a while, he retracted his gaze and sighed. "I wonder if there are any resonators among the other true sages. If there are, when will they appear?" From his words, it was obvious what had happened to the great emperor. In reality, the great emperor's identity was none other than the resonator of the true sages that existed in the perfect world's template. Luo Fan's sixth calamity was able to replicate billions of perfect worlds from the endless state of chaos. It was needless to say how powerful it was, since it had also replicated the innate Taoism bodies in the world, making the innate Taoism bodies in the perfect worlds that used those worlds as templates to be exactly the same as the world that used those worlds as templates. Then it was self-evident how deep the replicas were. With this kind of power and this kind of replication, would it let go of the true sages that existed in the perfect world? The creator of a perfect world must be a true sage. No matter how bad a perfect world was, there must be a creator of a true sage. What's more, after countless years of development in a perfect world, there would definitely be cultivators who would receive endless blessings from the world and eventually become true sages. This calamity replicated the perfect world in order to deal with Luo Fan, who was going through the calamity. Since that was the case, as the strongest true sage in the perfect world, how could it let go of him? Even if the true sage had a majesty that surpassed everything, the calamity could not replicate him completely. However, through the corresponding environment, an individual that could resonate with the true sage could be derived. From another, indirect point of view, it was obviously possible for the calamity to obtain a bit of the true sage's power. Obviously, the great emperor from before was such an existence. The benefits he obtained when he entered the fog at the end of the world were obtained because he resonated with a true sage in the perfect world that was used as a template by the world. What kind of incredible existence was a true sage? In Luo Fan's previous Great Tribulations, the Great Tribulation of heaven and earth was enough to dominate the entire Great Tribulation and even destroy the countless backup plans of the Great Tribulation. Even if the resonance between the great emperor and the true sage was insignificant, or even insignificant enough to not attract the attention of the true sage, it was enough to cause an earth-shattering upheaval and cause his essence to transform. Therefore, at that time, he was instantly promoted from a rank 1 pseudo-sage to a rank 9 pseudo-sage. That was why his potential skyrocketed by hundreds of millions of times, to the point that even Luo Fan could not detect it clearly. However, how could there not be a price to pay for resonating with a true sage? An existence like a true sage was already a supreme existence that surpassed all cultivators. Even if it was just a trace of an insignificant characteristic, it was already not something that the great emperor could bear. In fact, the moment he resonated with the true sage, the great emperor's ego had already been changed by that resonance. His mind, his cognition, and everything about him had been completely distorted by the characteristic that resonated with him at that moment. After that, in order to resist the ever-increasing calamity, he could only continue to stimulate his potential and fuse with the subtle characteristic that he had obtained from resonating with the true sage. This caused his ego to become more and more deceived, causing everything about him to become more and more distorted. In the end, when he truly stepped into the false sage level, there was already an essential difference between him and his original self. Everything that originally belonged to him had been completely covered up and became the things that happened before ordinary people could remember. It was precisely because of this that he had completely forgotten about Luo Fan and the various cultivation principles that Luo Fan had taught him, as well as the fundamental reason for cultivating the mysteries of cultivation. Chapter 23:33. Originally, according to Luo Fan's plan, he should have waited for a period of time, at least until the great emperor's ego had grown to the point where it could compete with that special trait. Only then would he wake him up and let him recognize himself. After all, only by reaching that level would he have the possibility of regaining his sense of self. Only then would he have the possibility of defeating or even completely absorbing that special characteristic. Unfortunately, as mentioned before, the great emperor couldn't bear to wait due to his instincts. Therefore, Luo Fan could only comply with his choice and make it clear. After all, to him, the great emperor was merely a living creature that was born from the great calamity to deal with him. there was still a fundamental conflict between them. Naturally, he would not take the risk of enmity with the great emperor for the great emperor's sake. Moreover, in addition to this, Zhou Bao also had some ideas that he could take advantage of this opportunity to implement. To a certain extent, the great emperor's choice was a good thing for him. That was why everything that had happened earlier had happened. While Luo Fan was thinking about the gains and losses, the perfect world outside had undergone a tremendous change. An indescribable sorrow emerged from the bottom of the hearts of all living creatures, filling their hearts and making them feel indescribable sorrow. In this sorrow, they couldn't help but shed tears. It was as if they had suddenly lost something that was very important to them. What's going on? Why am I suddenly so sad? Why am I in so much pain? The pinnacle quasi-sage was dealing with the problems left behind in his territory for the past 300 years. Suddenly, he felt a lump in his throat and tears flowed down uncontrollably. He couldn't help but feel a strong sense of uneasiness in his heart. With a slight thought, he lifted his foot and took a light step out of his cave abode. Looking around, the entire world seemed to be shrouded in this indescribable sorrow. What is it? Could it be? He was shocked. Suddenly, he thought of something and looked up at the sky. His gaze pierced through the endless distance and directly saw the palace hanging in the void, which was originally emitting endless light and seemed to exist together with the sun and the moon. The moment he saw the hall clearly, his expression changed drastically. "Great Emperor!" he cried out in surprise. His voice was filled with doubt, shock, and despair. In his eyes, cracks appeared one after another on the surface of the supreme palace, spreading and connecting at an unimaginable speed. Not long after, the original lines had turned into a large expanse, covering every inch of the entire palace. The mysterious light that was constantly being emitted from the palace started to tremble at this moment, as if it had run out of energy and was about to collapse. More and more gazes were directed towards the hall when they noticed the changes in the brilliance. When they discovered the changes in the hall, an even deeper sorrow and panic rose from the bottom of their hearts, causing them to wail, cry, and roar. The tears that had involuntarily gushed out earlier were like a flood that had burst a dam. The sorrow and anguish of the scene were indescribable. As the palace changed, the entire void started to darken, and a faint blood-red light started to fill the void. A series of thunderbolts began to reverberate in the void. Then, rainwater started to fall. The rainwater was originally colorless and transparent, but under the illumination of the dark, blood-red sky, it was dyed a faint red. It looked like endless blood was pouring down from the sky. This is the world crying. This thought appeared in everyone's hearts. The sorrow in their hearts became even more intense as they thought about this. The tears that had already shown signs of stopping could no longer be stopped. At this moment, the palace finally collapsed with a loud bang, turning into countless fragments that scattered in all directions. Like countless meteors, they streaked across the sky and fell madly to the ground, leaving behind a beautiful scene in the void. As the palace collapsed and turned into countless meteors, the brilliance that had descended from the sky like another sun also disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared in the first place. The entire world fell into the greatest darkness since the great emperor's reappearance. It was just like how everyone felt at this moment. The great emperor has fallen. It was unknown who said this, but it caused the sky to be filled with cries. This caused the entire world to be shrouded in an unimaginable sorrow. Among all living beings, there were only a few who had seen the great emperor. Although there were many more who knew about the great emperor, compared to the countless living beings in the world, they were only a small portion of them. In other words, there were not many people who truly knew and acknowledged the great emperor at this moment. However, under such circumstances, the sky was filled with cries and the sorrow and pain that permeated the world. Every living being's pain and sorrow came from their own hearts, The reason for this was very simple. At this moment, everyone, regardless of whether they knew the great emperor or not, felt an indescribable sorrow and fear from the bottom of their hearts. The sorrow came from heaven and earth out of thin air. The fear came from their instinctive uneasiness. The sorrow bestowed by heaven and earth was enough to cause them to feel sad, to cause them to grieve, to cause them to cry bitterly. However, only the uneasiness of being unable to control their bodies and minds, as well as the fear of their lives being threatened, could cause the sorrow to seep into their hearts and hearts. The sorrow lasted for 9 days and 9 nights before it subsided. During these 9 days and 9 nights, the entire world seemed to have become a world of rain and blood. The entire world, no matter what it was, no matter what kind of scenery it was, seemed to be expressing a kind of sorrow and pain. As for the living beings, the sorrow and pain had long turned into their cries, which were vividly displayed. After 9 days and 9 nights, the rain gradually stopped, and the sky became clear again. The roars of thunder that filled the sky also slowly disappeared. The sorrow that appeared out of thin air in everyone's hearts also gradually faded at this moment, allowing them to regain a bit of spiritual freedom and emotional freedom. Nevertheless, even so, the entire world seemed to be suffering from a serious illness. It was filled with a dispirited atmosphere at all times, making it difficult for all living beings to gather their wills, gather their fighting spirit, continue to cultivate and continue to pursue power. Looking at the empty sky, the peak quasi-saint gathered his spirit and said, "Since the great emperor has fallen, we're the only ones who can shoulder the responsibility of protecting the world." As he spoke, he gathered his strength and transmitted his voice to the 3,000 cultivators who were listening to the great emperor's sermon with him. Before listening to the sermon, the status of the quasi-saints might be different from the other cultivators who were chosen to listen to the sermon with them. However, after listening to the sermon for 300 years, their statuses had obviously been pulled closer. Although there was still a difference in their statuses, they were at least on the same level. As soon as his voice passed through, he heard several voices entering his ears. These voices were also transmitted by the other quasi-saints, and the content was similar to what he had transmitted. They were also calling the cultivators who were listening to the great emperor's sermon to gather together and discuss this earth-shattering upheaval. Evidently, those cultivators also had the same sense of mission as the peak quasi-saint and decided to shoulder the responsibility of protecting the world. Hearing these voice transmissions, the peak quasi-saint could not help but reveal a faint smile despite his heavy heart. At the very least, he was not fighting alone. At the very least, he still had like-minded companions who worked hard to protect the world with him. When the sky was about to collapse and the giant pillar above his head was about to collapse, this situation was a great comfort to him. Next, the 3,000 cultivators gathered and immediately formed a huge alliance. The news that the chaotic creatures would descend to clean up the world after 3,000 years was also publicized. All kinds of information and mysteries of the truth path that they had heard from the great emperor were also constantly being publicized. Through this unstoppable effort, all living beings soon recovered from the sorrow of the great emperor's death. They began to work hard for their own lives. After all, the death of the great emperor was a huge disaster for them, and they would be sad for millions of years before they could recover. However, no matter how sad they would never abandon themselves or put their sorrow above their lives. After knowing that the chaotic creatures would descend to threaten their lives, the threat of their lives naturally suppressed their sorrow and allowed them to quickly get rid of it. They began to use all their efforts to improve themselves so that they could fight against the disaster that would descend after 3,000 years. Because of this change, the entire world seemed to improve. The original sorrow and sadness were dispelled at an unimaginable speed. Hundreds of years later, the death of the great emperor had almost become an ancient legend. Another 1,000 years later, no one mentioned the great emperor at that time. Everyone was only guessing what the chaotic creatures would look like, how terrifying they would be, and what methods they would use to fight against them. Just like that, 3,000 years passed in the blink of an eye. Time had unknowingly come to the moment that the great emperor had mentioned, the moment when the chaotic creatures would descend. How will the chaotic creatures appear? This question appeared in the minds of many living beings. In particular, the 3,000 cultivators who were the higher-ups of the entire Great Alliance were more concerned about the answer to this question. Among these cultivators, most of them were survivors who had participated in the previous world calamity. To them, dealing with the chaotic creatures that came from outside the world was equivalent to dealing with a small world calamity. With their experience, they had already reached the limits of what they could do in the past 3,000 years. Whether it was setting up formations, setting up defensive areas, refining divine abilities, or crafting artifacts, they had already reached the limits of what they could do in the past 3,000 years. Although it had only been 3,000 years, their cultivation realm was stronger than that of the great emperor back then. Therefore, their preparations were much more perfect than when they faced the world calamity. At the very least, if they encountered a calamity like the first world calamity again, the world's performance would definitely be 100 times stronger than before. Of course, this would only happen if the calamity did not change. If something happened to the world calamity, the outcome would be unpredictable. In any case, we've already done everything we could. As for what happens next, we can only leave it to fate, another quasi-saint said with a sigh. Up to fate? A quasi-saint harumphed, clearly dissatisfied with that word. They were currently resisting the calamity imposed by fate. How could they leave it up to fate? In his opinion, this kind of attitude was clearly a negative one. Naturally, it made him feel displeased. The quasi-saint who said that they would leave it to fate could not help but smile bitterly. I was wrong. At this moment, the entire world fell into an inexplicable tension. Even the living beings with the mark of destruction fell into silence at this moment. They did not secretly carry out destructive actions like they did in the past. Instead, they waited for the chaotic creatures to descend together with the other living beings. These creatures with the mark of destruction were determined to destroy everything, to destroy everything, to destroy this world, and even themselves. However, after reincarnating time and time again, they eventually gained wisdom and knew how to weigh the pros and cons. They understood that if they took any action before the chaotic creatures descended, they would most likely block the disaster for the chaotic creatures and completely bear the attacks that the chaotic creatures were supposed to bear. Under such circumstances, how could they jump out at this moment? Due to this reason, the world fell into a calm state like the calm before a storm. An oppressive feeling enveloped the entire world. In the hearts of all living beings, the arrival of the chaotic creatures naturally came from the sky. Therefore, at this time, even the 3,000 cultivators who were listening to the truth preach were paying more attention to the void. They were vigilant against the danger coming from above, waiting for the extremely dangerous, ugly, and powerful creature that could appear in the sky at any time. Chapter 23:34. When the chaos creatures descended, the location where they appeared caused countless cultivators to panic. That was because the chaos creatures didn't come from the sky. Instead, they broke through the void and appeared on the ground. Only an extremely small portion of them appeared in the depths of the ground and the sky. Damn it! The 3,000 cultivators were horrified. As their power surged, they quickly adjusted the direction they had prepared to deal with the chaos creatures that appeared out of nowhere from the sky. The relationship between the chaos state and heaven and earth was different from what ordinary living beings thought. In the eyes of ordinary living beings, and even the 3,000 cultivators who didn't know much about the chaos state, heaven and earth were like a circle. Inside this circle was the world that they came into contact with and lived in. Outside the circle was the extremely terrifying chaos state. In this way, any living beings born from the chaos state would obviously have to cross the boundary of heaven and earth and charge in from all directions if they wanted to enter this world. Because of this concept, they had placed their defenses against the chaos creatures in all directions and in the sky. However, it was obvious that this understanding was ridiculously wrong. The relationship between the chaos state and heaven and earth was actually many times more wonderful than what they knew. Heaven and earth had orderly time, space, matter, energy, as well as endless rules, laws, and everything else. On the other hand, the chaos state was an indescribable state where everything was intertwined in a chaotic manner and contained mysteries that countless heaven and earth didn't have. How could it be possible for such two existences to be placed together, as though they were all objects of order? Therefore, such a structure where heaven and earth were like a circle and the chaos state was like a boundless ocean outside the circle naturally couldn't exist. In fact, the relationship between heaven and earth and the chaos state was more like the relationship between a piece of paper and a vast space. This piece of paper was heaven and earth, and the boundless space that enveloped this piece of paper was the chaos state. This seemed to be no different from what ordinary people thought, where an individual was enveloped in an even larger area in the center. However, in reality, the relationship between the two was so huge that it couldn't even be described with words. One had to know that there was also space inside a piece of paper. In other words, there was no essential difference between heaven and earth and the chaos state in terms of position. There was only an indescribable barrier that separated heaven and earth from the state of chaos. From any position, as long as one broke through some kind of barrier, they would be able to directly break through heaven and earth and enter the state of chaos. However, there was no need to go to the end of the world and break through the strange boundary placed at the end of the world in order to enter the state of primal chaos. At this moment, the massive number of creatures that appeared out of thin air and began to wreak havoc in this world immediately reversed the misconceptions people had about the state of chaos. Quick, change direction. The 3,000 cultivators roared as they controlled the formations, abilities, powers, and magic treasures they were in charge of to attack the creatures in a frenzy. These creatures that appeared out of thin air were all extremely strange. Furthermore, every single one of them was extremely powerful. Just the aura alone was enough to distort the void and distort time. Even if it was a golden immortal realm cultivator at the first heaven realm, it was extremely difficult for the cultivator to attain victory when going against a living being, and it was even to the extent that the slightest bit of carelessness might allow the living being to seize onto the cultivator's weak point and annihilate the cultivator. Moreover, apart from being powerful themselves, these chaos creatures also carried all kinds of endless corrosive powers around them. Every single time his power was activated, it would cause a small area of chaos to arise in the laws of the world, and it even faintly affected the Grand Tao. It caused the originally extremely smooth circulation of the Grand Tao to suddenly seem to be filled with impurities, and it actually became difficult. The corresponding slowing down of the reaction was the best proof. Just the level of their power was enough to bring a great disaster to the living beings in this world. Coupled with the special characteristics that they possessed that were almost completely targeted to this world, the pressure they brought to the living beings in this world became even greater. In just a few breaths, the number of living beings that died because of the appearance of these creatures had already exceeded 10 million. Among these living beings, only less than 1% of them had truly activated their powers and dealt a sufficient blow to the arrival of these chaos creatures. It could be said that their deaths were worthless. After discovering this situation, the 3,000 cultivators almost went crazy. It had been so difficult for them to nurture so many cultivators. It could be said that the improvement of each cultivator's power contained a huge amount of their blood, sweat, and tears, as well as their intense expectations. But now, just because of this small mistake of theirs, these 10 million cultivators were completely destroyed before they could do much. At this moment, they understood even more clearly just how great of a calamity the arrival of these chaos creatures was this time. The pressure of the arrival of the calamity instantly skyrocketed by who knew how many times, causing the slight carelessness that originally existed in their hearts to instantly disappear without a trace. Kill! It was actually not difficult to adjust the effects of the various preparations. As long as they realized this, they could very quickly change their direction and set their targets on the chaos creatures that had appeared everywhere at this moment. After all, these preparations were originally prepared by the 3,000 cultivators with the power of all living beings. It could almost be considered a part of their strength, so how difficult could it be to adjust? Along with these battle cries, endless attacks began to bombard the huge number of chaos creatures that had just entered this part of the world from all directions, directly turning the places where the chaos creatures were into a gray, chaotic state. At this instant, the chaos creatures let out earth-shattering roars. Some of these roars were extremely painful, some were extremely angry, and some were extremely joyful. It was as if some of the chaos creatures had sensed danger and the crisis of death in this kind of attack and this kind of chaos. However, there were some creatures that felt comfortable and safe from it. Oh no, they are chaos creatures to begin with. Our attacks are too powerful, and have accidentally created a state similar to chaos in some places. The peak quasi-sage's expression changed at this moment, and he let out a cry of alarm. At this moment, somewhere where the chaos creatures were, the area that had been crushed by the countless attacks suddenly shook. Then, all the gray chaos seemed to be frantically devoured by a black hole, and finally disappeared completely, directly revealing the chaos creature that had been attacked. This chaos creature had an extremely strange appearance. It had 17 heads, 30 to 40 legs, and its entire body was covered with strange fur that constantly fluttered. Every time the fur fluttered, the surrounding spacetime would undergo a strange change, as if some strange spacetime was created and destroyed in this process. The creature's appearance was so ugly, yet it was so ferocious. Ordinary living beings would have nightmares for more than 10 days after taking a look at it. However, at this moment, the 17 heads of this creature roared at the sky in extreme joy. As it roared, the area it was in seemed to be suddenly gripped by a force. With a sudden squeeze and twist, the area was completely turned into powder, leaving only a bottomless pit under the creature's feet. At first glance, it was impossible to see the bottom of the pit. As for the city that originally existed here and the hundreds of millions of living beings in this city, they also disappeared completely. Damn it! With a furious roar, a huge fist descended from the sky and blasted at the junction between the 17 heads and the body of the chaos creature. The chaos creature itself was tens of thousands of meters in size, so its size was self-evident. However, although this fist was slightly smaller than the chaos creature, it wasn't much smaller. Its size was enough to cover every neck of the chaos creature. In other words, it was enough to affect every head of the creature. In the face of this punch, the chaos creature didn't react at all. Or rather, not all of its heads reacted at the same time. Some of its heads turned around and tried to bite the fist, while the other heads didn't move at all. In fact, they even twisted randomly, affecting the strength exerted by the heads that wanted to bite the fist. As a result, they couldn't stop the fist from imprinting on its neck and striking it directly. Terrifying power continuously poured into the neck of the chaos creature and began to wreak havoc inside its body. Boom, 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 boom. At this moment, a terrifying explosion sounded from within the body of the chaos creature. The sound was so terrifying that it felt as if countless worlds were exploding and shattering. Along with this sound, the chaos creature began to struggle frantically. Painful roars constantly sounded from its 17 heads. Amidst this loud roar, space and time continuously collapsed and was destroyed under the impact of the great Tao of the world. Then, it gathered with great difficulty and recovered with great difficulty. The power contained in the chaos creature's body was directly extracted from the state of chaos. This power was clearly different from the laws of this world, the great Tao, time, space, and everything else. This difference might not be considered much under normal circumstances, but at this moment, when it was unscrupulously triggering the backlash of this world, the effect was rather tragic. The endless pressure of the world frantically poured into the body of the chaos creature through the fist, completely ignoring the continuous explosions coming from inside its body. In the end, in the loudest and most intense explosion, the entire chaos creature exploded, turning into countless fragments that scattered in all directions. Then, under the corrosion of the world, it began to be rapidly annihilated and eventually disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. At this moment, the owner of the fist emerged from the void. It was a puppet, or rather, a magic treasure that looked like a puppet, and judging from the appearance of this magic treasure, it was a pinnacle quasi-saint. At this moment, the magic treasure swept across the surroundings. Its power surged and swept in all directions. It penetrated deep into the layer of laws of this world, and began to rapidly expel and destroy the special characteristics of the chaos creature that it was contaminated with. The might of this artifact was rather terrifying. Besides, it could adjust itself at the fastest speed through everything it came into contact with. After eliminating the chaos creatures, it dealt with the various remnants left behind by the chaos creatures. Naturally, it was successful in every endeavor. In just a few breaths of time, the magic treasure had completely dealt with the remnants above the layer of laws of the world, restoring the laws of this area to their original state. After completing all of this, it didn't stop at all. In a flash, it disappeared back into the void and headed to the next battlefield, the next location where the chaos creature was wreaking havoc. Only this bottomless pit, as well as the broken space-time and laws of the world that were wriggling and recovering with difficulty, were left behind. This showed just how tragic the battle had been. After the magic treasure left, strange imprints gradually emerged from the void. These brands seemed to be extremely strange. They were indistinct and seemed as if they didn't exist at all. Even though she could discern that they were brands, he was unable to discern the exact appearance of these brands. It was even to the extent that he couldn't confirm exactly what characteristics these brands possessed. The remnants of the chaos creature, or rather, the remnants of the chaos creature simulated by the catastrophe. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed in the palace that was in between reality and illusion. Compared to the cultivators that currently existed in this world, he was much more knowledgeable. These chaos creatures were completely strange, and dangerous existences to those living beings. However, in his eyes, they were merely clumsy imitations. Real chaos creatures were existences that could even possess the special characteristics of a true sage. Even if he encountered them now, or rather, if he encountered them when he was not in his fragmented state, he would probably have to go through many trials of life and death, and pay an unimaginable price to defeat one of them. Chapter 2335. At this moment, the large number of strange imprints that appeared after the so-called chaos creatures died were obviously the source of these chaos creatures. Luo Fan did not forget that although this world was real and had everything of a normal, perfect world, it was ultimately created by his sixth tribulation. In other words, what the living beings of this world thought to be in a state of chaos was, in fact, not the true state of chaos. Instead, it was merely a simulated state of chaos created by the great tribulation of heaven and earth. The chaos creatures born in such a simulated state of chaos naturally could not be the same as real chaos creatures, let alone possess the power of real chaos creatures. This was also in line with the performance of these chaos creatures in this world that Luo Fan had observed. And just like how the tribulation needed a perfect world that existed in the state of chaos as a template to create this perfect world, these simulated chaos creatures obviously also needed a template. These templates were obviously the huge number of imprints that appeared after these chaos creatures died at this moment. If the Great Tribulation could completely simulate the existence of true sage characteristics like the chaos creatures, it would be able to do it if it was only targeted at this world. But don't forget that there were billions of square meters of this world in this tribulation. Even if this tribulation was so powerful that it was beyond Luo Fan's imagination, it was absolutely impossible to simulate a chaos creature with true divine characteristics in a world that was billions of square meters. In contrast, some of the imprints left behind by the chaos creatures were the best simulators. Moreover, this was clearly in line with the development of this perfect world, and in line with the fate of this world. Due to these various reasons, the current situation that the world was in right now had appeared. This was also why these imprints appeared after the death of those chaos creatures, and the appearance of these imprints also proved one thing. That was, the cultivators of this world obviously did not fully stop these chaos creatures. After these imprints appeared, they naturally melted into the cycle of life in the world. As the laws of the world flowed, as the great Tao flowed, they gradually scattered everywhere in the world. They began to merge with life once more and gradually reincarnate. After reincarnating, these creatures still retained many of the characteristics of chaos creatures, but after all, they were affected by the world and combined with the laws of the world. They also contained the characteristics of the creatures of the world, and became some kind of extremely contradictory creatures. This kind of creature might not seem special in a short period of time, but as time passed and they began to grasp more and more powerful power, their uniqueness and wonder would naturally be revealed. Perhaps this would become the trigger for the next great tribulation of the world. Even the Archback then could see this possibility clearly with his false sage realm, let alone Luo Fan. The operation of the world is indeed indescribably exquisite. After watching for a long time, when the imprints in this location disappeared without a trace and melted into the cycle of life in this world, Luo Fan let out such a sigh. Although this world was created by the Great Tribulation and was a perfect world specifically for Luo Fan, it was a test for Luo Fan. However, a tribulation was a tribulation after all. It was not a punishment or a curse. It was impossible for it to completely ignore all other rules just to test Luo Fan and attack him. This world might have been created for Luo Fan, but once this world was created, it would no longer be under the full control of this great tribulation. Its existence, its fate, all had to follow the true and perfect way of existence of the world, as well as fate. After a normal perfect world developed and reached a certain level, it would trigger the great tribulation of the world. In that case, even if this perfect world was created by the Great Tribulation, it would definitely trigger the Great Tribulation of the world when it developed to a certain level. Even if the descent of the Great Tribulation of heaven and earth would affect the existence of this part of the world, or even destroy this part of the world, which seemed to contradict the purpose of this part of the world, it could not stop its descent. Similarly, all sorts of normal and perfect worlds had to go through all sorts of things that they had to go through after this world was created. This was also the reason why this world had always behaved so strangely. There were many rules that Luo Fan could make use of. In fact, even though Luo Fan was in this world and the purpose of this world was to destroy him, he could still live well. He could even indirectly control the situation of this world and affect the state of this world. It could even be said that this was where his chance of survival lay. After sighing with emotion, Luo Fan's various thoughts calmed down, and he started to look at other places in this world with an almost indifferent gaze. He looked at the battle between countless living beings and the chaotic creatures, and watched them struggle between death and survival. After all, the 3,000 cultivators had the experience of the last great tribulation of the world. Facing the tribulation of the chaotic creatures, they quickly gained a firm foothold and began to annihilate the chaotic creatures in an orderly manner. They liberated areas that were occupied by the chaotic creatures, and restored areas that were eroded and modified by the chaotic creatures. However, there were too many chaotic creatures after all, and they were too powerful. Although the cultivators could rely on various methods to continuously eliminate them, the price they paid in the process was rather huge. At the very least, the speed at which the living beings in this world were disappearing had reached a state that made those living beings' hearts ache. This isn't the great tribulation of the world. This really isn't the great tribulation of the world. At a certain location, a connate perfected immortal realm cultivator dodged the attack of the chaotic creature with great difficulty, and he finally couldn't help but roar. The chaotic creature that he was fighting should be a living being without a head or a tail, and it seemed to be just a spherical being. However, its strength had even reached the limits of the connate perfected immortal realm. The chaotic radiance on its body flowed and fluctuated, and the surrounding space was completely minced into pieces and controlled by the light. It transformed into countless tentacles that ceaselessly moved back and forth in space, slaughtering and destroying everything. On the other hand, the ground around it had become a scene of desolation. The plants that originally existed had completely vanished, and even the occasional bits that remained were charred like coal. As for the sky, it was filled with a bloody glow, and it seemed like there was a large expanse of bloody clouds floating in the sky and ceaselessly warping and fluctuating. On the other hand, the companions of the connate perfected immortal realm cultivator had been reduced from tens of thousands to only a few dozen now. The remaining ones were either a tenth or even less of their broken limbs, or they were directly annihilated without even a single broken limb left behind. The degree of devastation had long since surpassed the imagination of the connate perfected immortal realm cultivator. It had even surpassed his imagination of the great tribulation of the world. It's not the great tribulation of the world. At this moment, a connate perfected immortal realm cultivator who was lucky enough to survive shattered a tentacle formed from countless fragments of space and chaotic energy with great difficulty as he spoke. The great tribulation of the world is countless times more devastating than this. He panted heavily before spitting out the truth that caused the despair in his companion's eyes to skyrocket. The great tribulation of the world. Even a tribulation like this is countless times weaker than the great tribulation of the world. How did all of you survive? How did we survive? I don't know either. The connate perfected immortal realm cultivator, who was obviously a survivor, smiled bitterly and said, looking at how honest he was, no one could treat his words as a perfunctory answer. For a time, the scene fell into silence. There was only an indescribable atmosphere that kept piling up, and it caused the mentality of the survivors to gradually collapse. The result of this collapse was that the destruction that the egg-shaped chaotic creature caused to them and the surroundings began to skyrocket. The speed at which their companions were dying began to increase continuously. What are all of you doing? At this moment, a furious roar descended from the sky. A puppet-like creature descended from the sky, and a huge hand directly tore through space and arrived above the egg-shaped chaotic creature. It grabbed at the egg-shaped chaotic creature. Even space-time and the laws of space and time couldn't withstand this grab. They created an endless expanse of absolute nothingness. It looked like there was a large expanse of pitch-black darkness that wanted to completely devour the egg-shaped creature. At that moment, the egg-shaped creature instinctively reacted. Countless chaotic powers surged out of its body, condensing into countless tentacles that charged towards the giant hand. Crack, crack, crack. The entire world seemed to have begun to shake from the loud sound. In a trance, everyone felt an indescribable fear emerge from the bottom of their hearts. They couldn't help but quickly retreat. The final outcome of this collision was none other than the huge hand directly grabbing the egg-shaped chaotic creature and forcefully breaking it. It penetrated deep into its body and unleashed some unknown technique. Subsequently, the egg-shaped chaotic creature and the countless tentacles it condensed collapsed at the same time. Amidst this collapse, the space and laws in an area of countless kilometers collapsed completely, and even the puppet-like creature was devoured as well. It seemed like it was about to vanish within the chaos. If the connate golden heavenly realm cultivators had not avoided this chaos, then they would have definitely been devoured completely and even lost their lives. The puppet-like creature was clearly the magic treasure refined by the peak quasi-saint realm cultivator. Moreover, it seemed to have become many times stronger than before. At the very least, the efficiency it displayed when dealing with the egg-shaped chaotic creature was much greater than before. For a magic treasure like this, the collapse of spacetime and laws was obviously not a big deal. Although it was devoured, it didn't take long for it to crawl out of the chaotic abyss. It looked exactly the same as before, and there was nothing unusual about it at all. Under the illumination of the chaos in the surroundings, it seemed as sacred and dignified as the god of creation that suppressed the world. There's still a long way to go before despair. The magic treasure glanced at the cultivators who were trying their best to avoid the chaotic space in the surroundings and spoke before its figure flashed and vanished without a trace. Obviously, it had left this area and headed to another place where the chaotic creatures were wreaking havoc. As for eliminating the corrosion and assimilation of the chaotic creatures to the laws, there was naturally no need to do that at this moment. After all, the laws in this area had completely collapsed. The assimilation of the chaotic creatures had naturally vanished at this moment, and it was impossible for it to affect this area anymore. The connate golden heavenly realm cultivators who were in despair earlier were shocked at this moment, and the despair in their eyes gradually faded as they looked at the chaotic space in front of them. After a while, the connate golden heavenly realm cultivator, who was the first to sigh that this was actually not a calamity of the world, said to his companion, "I suddenly understand why all of you were able to survive. I also understand why we were able to survive." His companion smiled at this moment while an indescribable glow of understanding appeared on his face, and his eyes were filled with indescribable determination. The connate golden heavenly realm cultivator couldn't help but laugh when he saw his companion's expression and gaze, and he said, "Looks like I don't have to say anything else. Let's go. Let's destroy those chaotic creatures. This world is our world, and they'll have to go through us if they want to cleanse this world." As they spoke, they laughed loudly and shot swiftly towards another area where the chaotic creatures were wreaking havoc. Based on their mental state, the despair they had before was completely gone, and it seemed like they were a completely different group of people from before. After they left and the chaotic space in that area gradually calmed down, bits and pieces of strange marks appeared in this area, and then they vanished without a trace along with the reincarnation of the world. Incidents similar to what happened in this area were happening all over the place at this moment. Many cultivators were annihilated in the battle, and not even a trace of them was left behind. Many cultivators had lost all their will to fight because of that terrifying encounter, and they were filled with despair. But most of them were stimulated and strengthened in the battle, and they even found their own beliefs and became the main force of this world against the chaotic creatures. Chapter 2336. Chaotic creatures were born in the state of chaos. Although the state of chaos contained endless mysteries and contained everything in the world, it was extremely chaotic. However, it was precisely because it was all-encompassing and contained everything that it seemed to be extremely chaotic. This kind of chaos was reflected in chaotic creatures. The difficulty for them to develop intelligence was billions of times greater than that of ordinary living beings in the world. Of course, no matter how difficult it was, there were still chaotic creatures that could turn the impossible into the possible. They would seize the chance that was billions of times greater and develop their own intelligence. However, once they developed intelligence, these chaotic creatures would no longer be chaotic creatures, but true saint-level beings. Evidently, true saint-level beings could not appear in this great tribulation, nor could they be duplicated into this world to test the living beings of this world. Therefore, the chaotic creatures that had entered this world were clearly at a huge disadvantage compared to the intelligent life forms in this world. That was intelligence. No matter how powerful chaotic creatures were, they were not without weaknesses compared to intelligent living beings without intelligence. Even if their strength could bring great losses to the intelligent living beings, once their weaknesses were revealed, it would only be a matter of how much it would cost to deal with them. Hence, in the next 10,000 years, even though there were many chaos creatures and the destruction they caused was huge, to the point where they vaguely wanted to turn the world upside down and return the world to its misty state when the world was first born, there were still many chaos creatures in the world. But in the end, after more than 10,000 years, after nearly 80% of the living beings in this world had entered the cycle of reincarnation, the last living being that had entered this world was completely crushed under the efforts of the many cultivators who had been fortunate enough to survive. As for the leader of the huge alliance that united all the cultivators and living beings in this world, there were less than 100 people left among the 3,000 cultivators who were still alive. Even the cultivator who was already at the peak of the quasi-saint realm, and was only a step away from becoming a false saint, had already been sacrificed. Currently, the highest cultivation base in this world was only a greater perfection quasi-saint. If that was the case, there was no need to mention the other cultivators. At this very moment, almost every cultivator and every living creature in the world had lost most of their friends and relatives as the price. As for other things, such as the current state of this world, there was no need to even mention them. At this moment, the entire world could be said to be in a state of desolation. There was almost no area that was unscathed. All kinds of dangerous places that did not exist in this world before had replaced the originally beautiful natural environment of this world, causing this world to look like a completely different world at this moment. It's finally over. It had been a long time since they sensed the miserable cries, explosions, and impacts that had filled the world for over 10,000 years. Only then did those living beings gradually come to their senses. It turned out that their disaster had already passed. When they came back to their senses, all the living beings were filled with sorrow. No matter how strong the creatures were, their eyes instantly reddened and their noses tingled. Those who were slightly weaker instantly burst into tears, venting the sorrow and pressure that had accumulated in their hearts for tens of thousands of years. The entire world fell into an indescribable crying sound. It sounded as if this crying sound was the mainstream of this world. The crying continued for a long time, and at some point, it turned into loud laughter. Compared to the deafening cry, the laughter was more infectious. It spread more widely and had a greater impact. It caused the sorrow and pain that had accumulated in this world to unknowingly disappear without a trace. Instead, it turned into a kind of excitement, a kind of joy that came from surviving 100 disasters. Their sorrow was naturally because all of them had lost more than one of their relatives and friends in the past 10,000 years. Even many of their like-minded companions had been sacrificed in the great calamity. At that time, because of the impending calamity, they did not have the time or energy to grieve and feel pain. Now that the calamity was over and the pressure was gone, the sorrow and pain that had been suppressed for a long time naturally erupted. There was no need to say much about their excitement. Although they had paid such a great price, they had still obtained victory in the end. They had saved themselves and the world. From now on, the storm had passed, and the rainbow hung in the sky. Everything seemed so wonderful. How could they not be excited? How wonderful! At this moment, Luo Fan let out a sigh of emotion in the palace that was between the real and the fake. The development of the situation in this world over the past 10,000 years was like an epic. It was an epic that described the resistance of a world's living beings against the calamity and the end of the world. In it, Luo Fan saw countless heroic actions, countless great deeds of sacrificing oneself for others, and countless unwavering wills and eternal beliefs. Although it was a little cynical to say such a wonderful thing, It was his true feelings, his true thoughts. Luo Fan, on the other hand, would never hide his true thoughts in order to avoid suspicion. However, this is only temporary. Next, this kind of calamity will continue until the next great calamity. Perhaps it is too early for you to be happy. Luo Fan sighed. At this moment, his fragment was already close to 90% complete. In the past tens of thousands of years, the countless determination and inspiration that the living beings had displayed had allowed him to find countless fragments that had turned into abstract attributes of cultivation methods. After gathering them together, he had condensed the fragments to this extent. After condensing 90% of the fragment, Luo Fan's strength had unknowingly recovered to the Supreme Emperor realm. With this kind of power, if he were to leave this palace that existed between the real and the fake, the entire world would be shaken by him. At that time, perhaps the will of the world would appear at the first possible moment to attack him and grind him into pieces once more, allowing him to return to the state where he had turned into an unknown number of billions of fragments. This possibility was not great, but it was definitely not zero. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan did not have any intention of leaving the palace that existed between reality and illusion. Instead, he remained in the palace quietly and watched the living beings licking their wounds and repairing the damage to the world. This feeling that was close to confinement was obviously not something Luo Fan was willing to endure. Therefore, he already had a plan in his heart. With a slight movement in his heart, there was naturally a lot more content in the cultivation methods of countless cultivators. What's going on? The cultivators licking their wounds were in a state of being frightened by the mere twang of a bow. They could not help but be shocked when they suddenly saw that there was more content in their cultivation methods that they did not understand. It had to be said that even cultivators who did not cultivate the cultivation method they created would have a complete grasp of the cultivation method after so many years of cultivation. They would also have a complete understanding of all the secrets within the cultivation method. They already knew what kind of hidden secrets, what kind of extensions, and what kind of variations there were. Under such circumstances, the content that appeared out of nowhere in the cultivation methods was equivalent to suddenly telling them that everything they experienced was just an illusion. Even they themselves were just an illusion. They were almost like a program that was under the absolute control of some supreme being. One could imagine how shocked they were. However, after all, there were still some cultivators who had existed for a longer period of time. They clearly remembered when something similar had happened in their memories. It's the origin of the method. At that moment, all sorts of surprised and excited voices rang out everywhere. As they recalled similar things that had happened in the past, they paid even more attention to these additional things in the cultivation method. Regardless of why the origin of the method did not appear in the previous tribulations and did not give them any guidance, the knowledge and strength of the origin of the method were acknowledged by the cultivators who knew of its existence. At this moment, it took some action to tell them about these things through the changes in the cultivation method. This clearly indicated that, in its opinion, these things were perhaps more important than the tribulations that they had experienced in the past, such as when the chaotic creature cleaned up the world. With this understanding, how could they ignore these changes? At that moment, they began to diligently study the changes produced by the cultivation method. These changes were not simple. At first glance, it seemed to be just a description of a new use of a certain power, a new evolution, and a simple extension of the cultivation methods. However, if one were to analyze it carefully, they would discover that there was a shocking truth hidden within these words. That was, from now on, this world would experience tribulations that could destroy the world every few years. How is this possible? This is nonsense, isn't it? Why are there so many tribulations? One cultivator after another roared in shock. There were quite a lot of descriptions of tribulations in those cultivation methods. Some of the cultivation methods even had methods to deduce the timing of the tribulations. Therefore, among the cultivators who studied the cultivation methods, there were quite a few who could deduce the timing of the next tribulations. 80,000 years. Why is it only 80,000 years? What can we do in 80,000 years? The world won't even have enough time to return to the state before the tribulations, right? Some cultivators roared at the sky. Their voices were filled with anger, unwillingness, and a hint of despair. Faced with such cries, Luo Fan did not respond. The cultivators could not find Luo Fan either. After shouting for a while, they could only stop and consider what to do. Fortunately, the huge alliance that dealt with the previous tribulations by the chaotic creatures had not dispersed, and the survivors were still organized. Therefore, the information contained in the newly added contents of the various cultivation methods was quickly sorted out in its entirety. The reason for the continuous tribulations was also revealed. The life imprints of the chaotic creatures still exist, and they continue to reincarnate in this world. Once their power accumulates to a certain level, it will erupt and trigger the shocking tribulations. This was the fundamental reason for the continuous tribulations. When they discovered this, the cultivators were filled with helplessness. They didn't expect things to turn out this way. Moreover, it sounded so reasonable that they couldn't find any reason to deny it, even if they wanted to find some far-fetched reason to do so. Imprints reincarnate? Why would the imprints of the chaotic creatures reincarnate in this world? Shouldn't they be rejected by the world and be erased after they appear? Why would the world include them in the reincarnation cycle? A cultivator raised this doubt. However, the answer to this question was also raised by another cultivator. Isn't it simple? How precious are the imprints of the chaotic creatures? The world includes them in the reincarnation cycle, and after repeated reincarnations, it will naturally devour them and turn all the resources it contains into its own. If you were the world, would you do it? This answer was very reasonable, and all the cultivators knew that this was probably the case. At this moment, an indescribable resentment rose in the hearts of the cultivators. It was a resentment that targeted the world. Perhaps the imprints of the chaotic creatures entering the reincarnation cycle would be beneficial to the world, but it would be an unimaginable disaster for all living beings. It must be known that the imprints of the chaotic creatures would indeed be assimilated by the world in the reincarnation cycle, but how many reincarnations would it take before it was completely assimilated? 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000? Every time the imprints of the chaotic creatures returned to the reincarnation cycle, it was a tribulation for all living beings to cleanse the world of sins. In other words, before the world completely devoured the imprints, they would have to suffer the tribulation of the chaotic creatures cleansing the world every few years. Every few years, they would have to struggle for survival in the terrifying calamity that would destroy the world like they did in the past 10,000 years. How could they accept this indifferently? Although the resentment appeared at this moment, it was clearly not nurtured and strengthened. At least, it did not cause any abnormal phenomenon in the world. The entire world looked the same as before without any changes. However, Luo Fan, who saw everything clearly, was already very satisfied. Chapter 23:37. Tens of thousands of years passed unknowingly after this tribulation, where the chaos creatures cleaned up the world. During these tens of thousands of years, the world recovered from the tribulation with great difficulty. The living beings in the world recovered to the level before the great tribulation with great difficulty. The cultivation standard of the cultivation world also slowly approached the level before the tribulation during these tens of thousands of years. However, due to the pressure from the repeated tribulations, the world still maintained its order during the tribulations. In other words, it was more or less unified in order. As for the 3,000 cultivators, they had also recovered from their previous state of leadership. As for the positions that were vacated by the deaths of the tribulations, they were replenished over the tens of thousands of years. It was not those cultivators who had reincarnated, but some cultivators who were selected from other cultivators to make up for the original 3,000 cultivators. The reason for this was actually very simple. During the tribulations, they discovered that the 3,000 cultivators jointly decided the situation of the entire world. This structure took into account both efficiency and correctness, and it was the most suitable structure in their opinion. Under such circumstances, this structure was naturally replenished. From the huge loss of living beings to the number of living beings before the tribulation, one could imagine the number of new living beings. For the living beings who had survived, they finally understood how the survivors felt when they looked at them after the last tribulation. How naive! How are they going to deal with the next tribulation? Such thoughts involuntarily appeared in the minds of many living beings. It made them feel all sorts of indescribable impulses, the urge to tear apart the truth of the world right in front of them. For a time, all sorts of absurd legends began to spread in the world. These legends told of the many tribulations that the world had encountered in all sorts of specious yet terrifying ways. Listening to these legends, the newly born living beings were only shocked and proud of the history of the world. They did not feel any bone-chilling pain because of it, which made the survivors feel helpless. However, it was also because the next tribulation was still far away that the alliance led by the 3,000 cultivators did not react to it. They only did their best to make some preparations in the dark. In this way, this part of the world seemed to be extraordinarily peaceful. Just by looking at the state of this world right now, it was impossible for anyone to imagine that a tribulation was hanging over this world's head and could descend at any moment, and it was even more impossible for them to know that this world was about to be reborn amidst all these tribulations. Of course, order was a whole, and the situation might not necessarily be the same when it came to the individual parts. Chaos was occurring everywhere in the world. Occasionally, some destructive geniuses would be born somewhere in the world. After these geniuses were born, they seemed to be self-taught. They quickly grasped inconceivable abilities and obtained unimaginable power. Then, they began to destroy everything they saw without any purpose. After causing great or small losses, they were annihilated one by one, erased one by one. Similar things were happening all over the world. Apart from the fact that they were extremely similar, there were no other factors that could be linked to each other. After discovering this, the 3,000 cultivators, who were the rulers of the world, began to believe the information that they had obtained from the cultivation method. It was precisely because of this that they were so proactive in preparing for the 80,000-year period mentioned in the cultivation method. On this day, Luo Fan, who was in the palace between reality and illusion, felt his heart tremble. He faintly felt that there seemed to be some strange existence appearing at the boundary of this world. I sense something? At this moment, he could not help but feel inexplicably surprised. After all, his position in this world was rather awkward. Not only was he the target of this world, but he was also the target of the world's tribulations. It could be said that, to him, everything in this world was his enemy. Under such circumstances, how could he suddenly sense something in this world? With a thought, his eyes narrowed. His gaze pierced through the endless obstacles and arrived at the place where he sensed something. This place was the boundary between the world and the state of chaos. Or rather, it was the boundary between this world and the state of chaos that was simulated by the Great Tribulation. The scenery at this boundary didn't seem much different from when the Great Emperor came. It was still the same strange scene where time and space were extremely distorted. Perhaps the Great Emperor couldn't see through this, but Luo Fan was different. His knowledge, eyesight, and perception were enough for him to completely ignore the obstruction of the distortion. In an instant, he had already penetrated the distortion and sent his gaze to the layer of sky behind the distortion, where the world and the state of chaos intersected. Over there, he could see a strange vortex appearing. The distortion was extremely strange. It seemed like something was devouring the endless surroundings. It was like the sky formed by the state of chaos and the world intertwining. What Luo Fan sensed was this whirlpool, or rather, what existed inside this whirlpool. Let me see what it is, thought Luo Fan. With that thought, he raised his hand and grabbed forward. With this grab, his palm pierced through the endless obstructions in an instant and reached deep into the sky, directly grabbing towards the depths of the vortex. His current level of cultivation had already reached the level of entering calamity. This realm, compared to the cultivation realm of his main body, was naturally hundreds of millions of miles away. But that was only compared to his original body. Honestly speaking, his current cultivation level was enough for him to obtain almost infinite power. With this kind of almost infinite power, even the strange power formed by the state of chaos and the world could not completely erode his power in a short period of time. Of course, it was only for a short period of time. After all, it was a product that contained the characteristics of the state of chaos and the world's power. Even if it was a simulation of the great calamity, it was still a fatal existence to beings that could not completely transcend the limits of the world. It might be possible to resist it for a short period of time, but to resist it for a long period of time, or even control it, was an almost impossible task. Zzzzzzzzzzz. The moment his hand reached into the vortex, a strange sound suddenly came from his hand. Then, traces of corrosion rapidly appeared on the surface of his hand. His skin, muscles, blood vessels, and even bones were rapidly peeled off under the effect of the corrosion. Luo Fan had long been prepared for this change, but at this time, he was completely unfazed by it. Even his movements did not slow down in the slightest. In just an instant, he had already touched something in the center of the vortex. It was a strange spherical object that was about 2 feet in diameter. It lay quietly in the center of the vortex, producing a terrifying suction force that could shake the heavens and the earth, constantly absorbing everything around it. Even the moment Luo Fan's hand touched it, he felt the suction force acting on his hand. It began to crazily cut his flesh and bones, sending them into the center of the spherical object. During this process, he could clearly feel his flesh and bones being cut and peeled off. Luo Fan frowned slightly at this moment. This thing is quite extraordinary. With that thought in mind, he grabbed the spherical object with his hand and exerted force, forcibly pulling it out of the vortex. Amidst the creaking sounds, a strange spherical object that was 2 feet in diameter slowly broke away from the vortex and gradually emerged, slowly suspending in the void. This object was chaotic and seemed to be a mass of gray airflow that was constantly rolling, but it seemed extremely sturdy, as if nothing in the world could shake it. As it kept breaking away from the vortex, an indescribable tremor came from within, as if some existence was struggling fiercely, and also as if some existence was roaring crazily. Its ability to attract and absorb everything in its surroundings had also skyrocketed by an unknown amount. It felt as if even Luo Fan's palm was about to be completely devoured in an instant. Chaos creature? No, it doesn't look like a chaos creature. On the contrary, it looks more like a creature born from this world. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind at this moment. He had many speculations about the nature of this spherical object. After all, not only did he touch this spherical object with his own hands, but he also saw its appearance directly. At this moment, he had already sensed the nature of this object, which was why he had so many speculations. In his guess, this spherical object should be a sign that some kind of creature was being born. And judging from the inexplicable feeling this creature gave him, this creature should have some kind of connection with him. Before his palm was about to be completely corroded, Luo Fan finally took this spherical object and directly left the sky curtain that was the boundary between heaven and earth and the state of primal chaos, entering this side of the world. As the spherical object entered this world, boundless power began to flow out of the spherical object in a frenzy, as if a balloon had suddenly been popped, An indescribable despair came from the inside of the spherical object at this moment. With this despair, Luo Fan had an idea. He casually covered it with his hand, and a layer of barrier appeared between this spherical object and the world, completely isolating this spherical object from the outside world. With the formation of this isolation, the continuous flow of power from this spherical object instantly stopped. The entire spherical object seemed to be suspended in a transparent balloon, becoming extremely calm. At this moment, this world began to feel unhappy. At this moment, a layer of dark clouds began to appear above the void at the edge of this world. It was a layer of incomparably dark, looking like a liquid product formed by condensing ink or even evaporating water. An indescribable pressure descended from the sky, enveloping Luo Fan's palm that was gradually recovering. This appearance was extremely similar to the appearance of the great emperor when he obtained something from the border between the state of chaos and the world and returned. "There's no need to go against you now." As he muttered to himself, Luo Fan casually withdrew his hand and brought the spherical object through the infinite barrier. He directly returned to his palace and appeared in front of his body. When he arrived here, the spherical object began to tremble slightly. There seemed to be some kind of excitement, some kind of regret, and some kind of guilt coming from it. However, this change only appeared for a moment. Soon, the various emotions that were transmitted disappeared completely, and was replaced by absolute calmness. It was a calmness that was deeper and more stable than the calmness he felt when he had just escaped misfortune. In this calmness, people felt that even if the world collapsed and the world was destroyed, it wouldn't matter to him. It seemed that as long as he arrived here, he had already arrived at the safest place in the universe. At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. "So it's you. I didn't expect you to be born from the border between the world and the state of chaos, and not from this world." Why did he come to such a realization? There was no other reason other than that he had already understood that the spherical object in front of him was most likely formed from the reincarnation of the great emperor. As for why it was like this and why it would appear at the border between the world and the state of chaos, he had not thought of it before. Now, with a thought, he already had some guesses. The reason was probably because the great emperor was an existence that could resonate with the true saint that was born from the perfect world that was used as a template by the world. An existence at the true saint level had already completely disregarded the shackles of the world. To them, there was not much difference between being in the state of chaos and being in the state of chaos. Under such circumstances, perhaps there would be more traces of the true saint in the state of chaos around the world than the traces of the true saint that existed in the state of chaos. It was just like in the theory of evolution, humans walked out from the ocean. However, there would obviously be more traces of humans at the edge of the ocean than in the ocean. Chapter 23:38. Looking at the sphere quietly lying in the barrier that he had set up, Luo Fan completely understood why he could sense it. The relationship between him and the great emperor could be said to be complicated, but it could also be said to be simple. To put it in a complicated way, the great emperor had received a large amount of inheritance from him and received many benefits. The great emperor had even treated him like a teacher. However, in the end, it was also because of him that the great emperor had died and only left behind a mark to reincarnate. It had taken him so many years to obtain the chance to return. To put it in a simple way, the relationship between them was really simple. After all, this great emperor was created by this world and was used as a source of power to deal with him. To be honest, he was just an enemy. Under such a relationship, Luo Fan had grasped an extremely subtle and mysterious possibility behind him. In his heart, he regarded it as a possibility for him to deal with this world. It was because of this that he had such a strong feeling towards the great emperor. Looking at the sphere, he knew that if he allowed the sphere to evolve naturally, it would take tens of thousands of years for the sphere to completely evolve and return to the world. However, if that was the case, it would be greatly affected by the mark left behind by the true saint. In the end, it might even suppress the mark he had left in the great emperor's heart and cause the great emperor to completely forget him. All the preparations that he had made would be for naught. In that case, he naturally gave up on the possibility of waiting quietly and allowing the sphere to evolve naturally. Immediately, he raised his hand and pointed at the air. In an instant, boundless power began to gather towards the sphere in front of him from all directions. In the blink of an eye, it formed a huge whirlpool and began to compress the interior of the sphere. In just a few breaths, it had completely entered the sphere, and the sphere began to change at a speed that could be seen by the naked eye. The originally chaotic appearance gradually turned into the appearance of a perfectly round crystal ball. There was a crystal-clear feeling within it. As it floated there and rotated slightly, there seemed to be some kind of indescribable spirituality that kept seeping out. A kind of joy gradually spread out from the sphere and filled the surrounding barrier. It even gradually filled the vast universe inside the palace. "Open!" Luo Fan shouted. An indescribable tremor came from his voice and quickly gathered towards the sphere. It began to shake the sphere, causing it to jump. The throbbing became faster and more intense. After a few dozen breaths, a thunderous roar suddenly came from the sphere. Subsequently, countless cracks appeared on the surface of the sphere, and then it transformed into countless fragments that shot out in all directions along with a gust of wind. The power of these fragments was so strong that in just an instant, the starry sky inside the palace had been thrown into chaos. The countless stars within were pulled by a terrifying power, and the way they operated in the void changed. The endless star essence became chaotic, no longer as mysterious as before. Instead, it was replaced by a kind of absolute chaos. Any living creature that stepped into the starry sky of the universe would have to suffer a difficult test. The fragments directly seeped into the void and pushed out of the palace. They were about to rush out of the palace and out of this place that existed between reality and illusion. At the same time, at the boundary between the perfect world and the state of chaos, the sky began to churn violently, as if some kind of anger was being transmitted from it. This scene was naturally earth-shattering. It was enough to shock anyone who could sense it and make them understand that something unimaginable was happening. However, it was obvious that there were very few people in this world who could see and sense this scene. Only a few of the 3,000 cultivators were able to vaguely sense it. Therefore, although it was an earth-shattering change that shook the entire world and shook the boundary between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, it did not cause the chaos that should have arisen at this time. The cultivation world in the entire world still acted as if nothing had happened, and continued with what they were doing before. It was even to the extent that even the cultivators among the 3,000 cultivators who could vaguely sense this change didn't pay too much attention to it because the change was too grand and had exceeded the scope of their understanding. They merely treated it as a change in the way the world operated and didn't pay too much attention to it. Faced with such a change, Luo Fan naturally could not sit back and do nothing. At this moment, he thought of something and grabbed. The void changed, and boundless power appeared out of nowhere around the countless fragments, directly wrapping them up. Even though most of the fragments had broken through the void and time and disappeared from his sight, it could not change the fate of being easily grabbed and suppressed. As he grabbed the fragments, he moved slightly and shrank his power, bringing the fragments along with him. All of a sudden, they were all grabbed back and reappeared in front of him, around the powerful existence that had drilled out of the crystal ball. It was a baby that was only 100 days old and looked extremely fragile. The baby had 3 eyes and 4 elbows. It was the appearance of the most orthodox born Taoism aptitude in the world. At this moment, it opened its eyes and looked at the countless fragments around it. Its eyes were filled with endless desire, and it suddenly opened its mouth and inhaled. The countless fragments gathered into a river, and began to rush towards its mouth from all directions. In the blink of an eye, all of them had gathered. As the countless fragments converged, the baby's body began to grow rapidly, like a seed germinating. In just a few short breaths, it had grown from a baby that was 100 days old to a child that was about 5 or 6 years old. At this moment, the countless crystals had been used up, and not a single one was left. Obviously, after the power of all the crystals had been used up, the baby could only grow to this stage. At this moment, the baby turned around and suddenly bowed to Luo Fan, shouting, "Your disciple kowtows to you, teacher. You still have your previous memories?" Luo Fan said with a faint smile. Hearing this, a perplexed expression appeared on the child's face. He shook his head and said, "I've already lost most of my memories. I only remember some fragmented fragments. Among them, the fact that you're my teacher is the most stubborn." Hearing this, Luo Fan already understood what was going on with the child's memories. Thinking about it, because of his interruption, the child should have obtained the memories of resonating with the true divine, but he did not obtain much. Even the countless cultivation experiences he had accumulated in his previous life were also lost because of this loss. Subsequently, the memories of his previous life became fragmented and messy, which led to the current situation. However, perhaps to him this was really a good thing. After all, in his previous life's cultivation experience, apart from the guidance he received from Luo Fan, a large part of his own understanding came from resonating with the true divine. Not to mention that after he entered the chaotic state and the boundary between heaven and earth, he received endless information and endless understanding. At that time, all the information and mysteries that he had obtained had been transferred directly from the true sage's place. In this way, if he completely recovered those memories in this life, wouldn't he once again fall into the same fate as in his previous life? Similarly, he was assimilated by the true divine, and similarly, he could not obtain his true self. In contrast, now that he had only recovered some fragmented memories, he only had a deep understanding of his own fundamental situation. However, this was the best outcome. Now that you have been reborn, you need to completely cut off the connection with your previous life. Today, I will grant you the name of era severing. Are you willing? Luo Fan said calmly to the great emperor. When the child heard this, his 3 eyes lit up, and he thanked him joyfully. "Era severing, thank you, teacher, for giving me the name." Just as he agreed, he suddenly felt that an extremely heavy sky covering his heart seemed to be suddenly lifted. A kind of unprecedented relaxation, liveliness, and excitement appeared in his heart at this time, making him feel unprecedentedly comfortable. Even his expression became relaxed. At the same time, Luo Fan also felt that a certain kind of resonance that was produced from his body and connected with the supreme existence in and out of heaven and earth had suddenly weakened. Although it was not completely cut off, it had become faintly discernible, as if it could be cut off at any time. It seems that this method is effective. Looking at this scene, how could Luo Fan not know that his plan was indeed effective? At that moment, he did not waste any more time and began to talk about the most orthodox way of cultivation in this world to era severing. He began to explain the essence of the countless cultivation methods that he had collected through the many fragments to the child bit by bit. The content went from shallow to deep. Bit by bit, it contained the deepest level of wisdom. It contained the mysteries that were enough to shock any cultivator and any powerhouse. Era Severing was not an ordinary child, but a powerhouse who had many memories of his previous life. Although the memories of his previous life that he had obtained were only fragmented fragments, those fragments alone had actually raised his knowledge to a level that was far beyond that of any other cultivator. In this way, the content that Luo Fan was preaching in front of him was very profound and profound. Naturally, he understood it as soon as he heard it. For a moment, his heart was filled with shock and surprise. Then, He directly expelled all the distracting thoughts in his body and began to listen to the content that Luo Fan was speaking with all his heart, trying to understand any kind of thoughts that Luo Fan was conveying. Time passed by slowly. Unknowingly, 300 years had passed. During these 300 years, the universe in this palace did not seem to have changed at all. It was still in the strange state between chaos and peace, maintaining the state that was previously disturbed by the countless fragments. It was as if not a single minute or second had really taken effect in this palace in the past 300 years. However, compared to the stagnation of this palace, in the center of this palace, the figure in front of Luo Fan had vividly displayed the passage of time. In fact, it even made people suspect that not only had 300 years passed, but 3 million years, 30 million years, 300 million years had passed. This was because at this moment Duan Shi, who was hovering in front of Luo Fan in the center of this palace, had unknowingly grown from a 5 or 6-year-old child to a young man who looked like he was in his 20s. As for his cultivation realm, he had unknowingly broken through the realm that countless cultivators dreamed of breaking through, the false saint realm. In just 300 years, he had actually advanced step by step, growing from an ordinary mortal child who had no power to a false saint. Although he was not a true false saint that could transcend all the influence of heaven and earth, and he was only a false saint in the inner universe of this palace that Luo Fan had built, his progress was already beyond the imagination of all living beings. Normally speaking, not to mention 300 years, ordinary cultivators would not be able to complete such progress and grow into a false saint even after 3 million, 30 million, or 300 million years. Because of this, if one only looked at Duan Shi's progress, anyone would probably suspect if their perception of time was messed up. The previous period of time was not 300 years, but even longer. On this day, Luo Fan stopped and said to Duan Shi, "Let's stop this time. Your current cultivation realm has already reached its limit. If you continue to improve, your foundation will probably become unstable, and it won't be worth it." Hearing this, an indescribable expression appeared on Duan Shi's face. He seemed to be a little regretful, a little unwilling, a little grateful, and a little afraid. The complicated expression on his face showed how complicated his feelings were at this moment. After all, it was not like he really did not know anything. How could he not know how heaven-defying it was to obtain such a huge improvement in 300 years? He knew very well how terrifying the impact of such an astonishing increase on his foundation would be. Chapter 2339. After stopping, Luo Fan said to Duan Shi directly, "Not long from now, there will be another tribulation in the world. This tribulation isn't too big, but it's the best opportunity for you to train. You can go and undergo the tribulation." Hearing this, Duan Shi could not help but be stunned. Tribulation? Why were there so many tribulations in this world? He remembered that the first tribulation was only tens of thousands of years after the world was created. After that, another tens of thousands of years later was the tribulation that cleansed the world. It had only been tens of thousands of years since then, so why was there another tribulation? Luo Fan was not in the mood to explain this. Anyway, with Duan Shi's current strength as a false saint, as long as he left the palace and entered the outside world, he would naturally be able to find out everything and figure it out. No matter how much he said at this time, it would just be a waste of his saliva. Therefore, although he could see Duan Shi's doubts, he still waved his hand and sent him out. Seeing that Luo Fan was not in the mood to explain, Duan Shi could only bid farewell to Luo Fan obediently and leave the palace. The reason why Duan Shi became a false sage was because of Luo Fan's cosmos starry sky, or rather, this hall. Under such circumstances, after he left this palace, his cultivation realm began to decrease greatly. From the original false saint stage, it directly dropped to the peak of the false saint stage. To him, this decrease in cultivation realm was as huge as going from an immortal to a mortal. He could not help but take a long time to catch his breath and adjust his unbalanced mentality back to normal with great difficulty. It's still a little unstable after all. Fortunately, teacher has a good judgment. Otherwise, if this continued, I'm afraid it would be difficult to turn back in the future. After catching his breath, Duan sure sighed to himself. What he was sighing about was naturally Luo Fan's decision to stop him from continuously improving. Fortunately, Luo Fan had stopped him before. Otherwise, if he continued to improve like this, his foundation would become more and more unstable. In the end, when he left the palace, he might directly lose his strength due to the imbalance in his mentality. In the end, he would fall into the final fate of his previous life and be completely minced by his own strength, ending his current life. This feeling did not stay in his heart for long. When he left the place that was in between reality and illusion and re-entered this world, countless mysterious senses surged into his heart. Continuous tribulations. How can this be? Is this really the world of my previous life? Why didn't I sense so many tribulations in my previous life? Duan sure could not help but be shocked as he sensed the countless senses. One must know that according to his senses, there would be a tribulations every tens of thousands of years. Moreover, perhaps every single tribulation wasn't anything serious to the world itself, but to the countless living beings in this world, every single tribulation was a challenge to their lives. According to his senses, any single tribulation was capable of destroying at least half of the living beings in this world. There were two reasons why Duan Shi was able to sense everything so clearly. Firstly, although his cultivation had fallen to the peak of pseudo-saint stage 9 after he left the palace and was much weaker than his original pseudo-saint stage, he was still a pseudo-saint stage 9 after all. His cultivation and strength were still not something that any cultivator in this world could compare to. Their perception and deduction abilities were naturally much stronger than all the other living beings in this world. The second reason was that the heavens and earth didn't conceal the fact that the heavens and earth were about to encounter continuous tribulations like they did with other secrets of the heavens and fate. In other words, the heavens and earth were intentionally revealing the unending tribulations that were about to appear in the heavens and earth to all living beings, making it thousands of times easier for living beings and cultivators to discover this than to discover other heavenly secrets. It was precisely because of this that he was able to obtain so much information so easily and in such detail. Very soon, Duan Shi discovered the source of the endless tribulations through his senses. The imprints of those chaotic creatures. His three eyes shone brightly as if there was an infinite amount of divine light flashing crazily in his three eyes. An indescribable resentment kept seeping out from the depths of his eyes. He already knew the truth about the countless tribulations. He understood that he and the others were already being used as whetstones by the heavens and earth. A whetstone that wore itself down to help the heavens and earth grow. From the standpoint of the heavens and earth, it was only natural to do so. After all the living beings in the heavens and earth were born from it. It could be said that they were all its creations. Under such circumstances, what was wrong with using its creations to help it grow? However, it was obvious that this was only for the heavens and earth itself. For these living beings who were being used as whetstones, this was a fate that they absolutely could not accept. One must know that although they were born from the heavens and earth and could be considered as the heavens and earth's creations, they also had their own sense of self. However, they also had their own consciousness, independent will, and independent emotions. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how painful it was for them to discover that the heavens and earth were intentionally imposing tribulations on them and sacrificing most of their lives to help them grow bit by bit. At the same time, Duan Shi finally understood where the faint resentment that permeated the heavens and earth came from. This was because he could not help but feel an inexplicable resentment toward the heavens and earth. After a long while, he finally sighed. Although there was resentment in his heart, This sort of tribulation was not something he could eliminate. There was only one thing he could do right now, and that was to work hard to help this world overcome these tribulations one after another. Moreover, he could absorb as much as he could from these tribulations, so that his own cultivation could be improved as much as possible and ascend to a higher level. It's a great danger for me to resonate with a true saint, but I can't care about what happens to the living beings in this heavens and earth. Then, he turned to look in a certain direction. That thought flashed through his mind, but he eventually got rid of all the distracting thoughts in his heart. Resonating with a true saint was a fatal danger to anyone who wanted to maintain their own consciousness. After all, a true saint was a supreme existence compared to any other existence who had not become a true saint. This kind of existence was simply too profound, too grand, too mysterious, and too profound. It had even reached the point where a trace of its aura was enough to completely assimilate any existence who had not become a true saint. Under such circumstances, resonating with a true saint was equivalent to the true saint's essence floating above one's head and could descend and merge with it at any time. This was obviously equivalent to one enduring the danger of being assimilated by a true saint at all times. If one was not careful and accepted the resonance, one would be able to comprehend endless things and obtain endless mysteries that belonged to a true saint. However, one's self would also be assimilated by a true saint. In the end, one's self would completely disappear, and one would become some kind of incarnation of a true saint. Duan-Shi, who had received careful guidance from Luo Fan, was very clear about this. At this moment, he was looking in the direction where an indescribable feeling was constantly being transmitted to him. It was a strange feeling transmitted by a mysterious existence that was trying to attract him to merge with it and come into contact with it. If he had not received guidance from Luo Fan, he would definitely regard this as his own opportunity. Even if there were thousands of obstacles in front of him, he would break through them and go directly. However, now that he had received guidance from Luo Fan, he had already seen through the danger and understood that it was a trap that seemed beautiful but was actually extremely dangerous. A trap that targeted his independent existence. Immediately, he turned around and flew in the opposite direction. "Who are you?" Not long after, a wave of energy appeared around Duan-Shi and a series of questions entered his ears. An inexplicable feeling of being watched entered Duan-Shi's heart. "It's so familiar. They seem to be my acquaintances from my previous life?" Duan-Shi's heart skipped a beat as this thought flashed across his mind. It was the fragments of subtle senses left behind from his previous life that gave him an indescribable sense of familiarity from the feeling of being watched. However, it was something that happened in his previous life after all. What was left now were only some extremely broken fragments. Therefore, although he felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity, it was impossible for him to confirm who the owner of the feeling of being watched was, what their identity was, and so on. He stopped in his tracks and calmly said, "Who are you? I've just been born and I'm sure I don't have any enemies in this world. Why are you blocking my way?" As he spoke, his 3 eyes narrowed. His gaze seemed to pierce through the barriers of countless space-time and saw a certain palace deep in the layers of space-time. The palace also gave him an inexplicable sense of familiarity. Many of the details were even deeply imprinted in the fragments of memories he had left behind in his previous life. This made him understand that this palace was most likely created by him in his previous life. "Who exactly are you and Teacher Origin of the Technique? Why did you appear at the place where Teacher Origin of the Technique disappeared?" One after another, figures appeared outside the palace. One of them asked. This person looked like a middle-aged man. His entire body was surging with an aura that seemed to shake the void as he stood there. It was as if time and space could not restrict his existence and could not withstand his presence. This person was an existence at the peak of the demi-saint realm. He was only a step away from the false saint realm. This person also gave Duan Shi an incomparably familiar feeling. Moreover, it was an unprecedented sense of familiarity that surpassed everything else and everyone else. Great Emperor? Suddenly, the figure muttered as if he sensed something. There was disbelief in the depth of his eyes. However, he soon shook his head. No, you're not him. Although you look like him, you're definitely not him. He let out a long sigh as he said this. He seemed to be a little relaxed but also a little disappointed. He seemed to be inexplicably complicated. At this moment, Duan Shi smiled faintly and said, I'm teacher's new disciple. This time, teacher saw the impending disaster and asked me to come out of the mountain to train myself. You must be the strongest people in this world right now, right? That'll save me the trouble of looking for you. As he spoke, his heart skipped a beat. He lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure directly broke through the barrier of time and space as he rapidly approached the palace. Throughout the entire process, his figure was like an extremely sturdy object that was pushing away ice and snow. The scene was extremely violent and shocking. The palace was naturally the place where the 3,000 cultivators, who were the source of the order of this world, resided. In other words, it was where the authority of this world was located. All this while, the 3,000 cultivators had always been the ones who summoned others. No one had ever taken the initiative to find out where they were and come to the palace of their own accord. This was also the reason why they dared to question Duan Shi's identity, even though they could clearly sense how powerful he was and knew that he was many times stronger than the strongest among them. They even dared to use their power to imprison Duan Shi. However, at this moment they realized that the thing that they thought they could rely on was actually so fragile. Yet, under the hands of the figure in front of him, he was actually smashed into pieces without any resistance. For a moment, an inexplicable panic appeared in the hearts of the 3,000 cultivators, causing their expressions to change. There were even some who couldn't hold it in any longer. They had already activated their powerful abilities and started to attack the figure that was pressing towards them. In the face of such changes, Duan Shi only smiled faintly. He did not even need to take any action. Just the aura that he emitted was enough to easily destroy the powers that were constantly bombarding him. He was not affected at all. He easily arrived before the palace and stood at the entrance of the palace. At this step, there were countless mysterious and complicated formation runes constantly flickering and circulating around the palace. Vaguely, there was an unparalleled power brewing at this moment and began to gather towards Duan Shi. It was as if a huge thunderbolt had begun to compress above his head and could erupt at any time. Seeing this, Duan Shi only smiled faintly and poked with his hand. Countless forces were emitted from his hand and directly rushed into the endless formation runes around him, causing all kinds of indescribable reactions with the countless forces within. Chapter 2340. At this moment, the 3,000 cultivators in the palace rushed out one by one. The palace would usually protect the 3,000 cultivators. Now that the palace could no longer hold on, it would be their turn to protect the palace. Duan Shi only smiled faintly in the face of such a change. He looked at the cultivators who appeared one after another but did not do anything, let alone attack them. Who are you? The peak quasi-saint asked solemnly. At this moment, all the cultivators' energy was surging in their bodies. Their divine abilities, powers, and artifacts were all brewing in their bodies, ready to burst out at a fixed target at any time. The reason why they did not attack immediately was simple. It was because Duan Shi's strength was too powerful and his attitude was a little complicated. It did not seem like he had any ill intentions. Is it important who I am? I think the most important thing for all of you now is the upcoming tribulation, right? Duan Shi said faintly. Hearing this, the expressions of the cultivators couldn't help but change. Although they were extremely displeased with this person's attitude, they had to admit that what he said was the truth. At this moment, facing the endless tribulations, they had to unite all the forces in the world and gather all the existences that they could find that could assist them. In comparison, although the identity of the cultivator in front of them was unknown, there was no doubt that he was powerful. If such a powerful force could become their helper and help them resist the upcoming tribulation together, it would naturally be a great thing for them. However, if this cultivator were to become their enemy, and this power that they had originally yearned for turned into a power that was against them, then the result would be one disaster on top of another. The peak quasi-saint was very decisive. He made a prompt decision and withdrew all his energy. He said, "Since you're willing to resist the tribulations with us, please come in." As he spoke, he made an inviting gesture and invited Duan Shi into the palace. Duan Shi was not surprised by his reaction. Based on his familiarity with this cultivator, he knew that this was the cultivator's final decision before he even spoke. At that moment, he calmly stepped into the palace. What happened next was a matter of course. Although the crowd was still doubtful about Duan Shi's identity, the knowledge, strength, and means that Duan Shi had displayed had shocked all the cultivators. Therefore, in just a few years, Duan Shi had risen from an outsider that many cultivators were wary of to the top of the 3,000 cultivators. He had even reached a position where he could fight against a peak sage-to-be. In other words, in just a few short years, he had become one of the two people with the highest status in this world. His right to speak in this world had also increased to an unimaginable level. If any other cultivator in the world experienced such a change in status and power, it would naturally be enough to shock them to the point of losing their normal state of mind. However, none of this could cause any ripples in Duan Shi's heart. It wasn't because he looked down on everything else that came with this position, but because he was too familiar with all of this. He was so familiar with this position that he felt like he had always been in this position, or even a higher position. Now that he had regained this position, he was just regaining his position and power. In this way, this kind of gain would at most make him feel like he had lost something and regained it. How could it affect him so much? How could he lose his composure because of this? When Duan Shi obtained this position, the way that this world dealt with the tribulations gradually changed. Initially, it was only the preparation for various formations, magical treasures, and supernatural powers against living beings. Gradually, it was added to deal with astronomical phenomena, the evolution of nature, and the changes in the rules and laws of this world. The other cultivators did not understand this. They did not know what the purpose of all these preparations was. However, they also knew that with these preparations, the entire way of dealing with the tribulations was much stricter and more perfect. The faint uneasiness that was brought about by the way of dealing with the tribulations had also faded a lot. Coupled with the improvement of Duan Shi's position in the past few years, the changes were finally carried out without any objection. Is it really him or not? On this day, somewhere in the palace, the peak sage-to-be looked at a vaguely familiar figure and had the same doubt in his heart. The various means that this person had used over the years contained a profound perspective and knowledge. All of them allowed him to see the shadow of that supreme existence that once occupied the highest position in this world. In fact, even his aura and appearance allowed him to sense traces of that existence. However, such a thing was obviously impossible. They had made countless deductions back then, and the results of their deductions clearly told them that this existence was already dead. His soul had been scattered, and not a single trace of him remained. The result of this deduction was so absolute that it was completely different from the ambiguous results of other deductions. It was so much so that over the past few years, the 3,000 cultivators had even found some opportunities to carefully deduce this matter, and the results were the same as before. In the end, they all clearly told them that the person before them was not the same person from back then, that existence from all those years ago had still perished, and his soul had dispersed without a trace remaining. In this way, no matter how similar the figure before him was to that existence back then, It was impossible for the peak quasi-saint to think that it was him. However, if it was not him, then who was this person before him? Could it be his descendant? Or was it some kind of special existence that the origin of the technique had created using him as a template? Duan-Shi suddenly smiled when he sensed the peak quasi-saint's gaze. He said, "I know what you're thinking, but what you're thinking about is meaningless." The peak quasi-saint trembled slightly when he heard this. He calmly said, "How is it meaningless? Although it's unlikely, the source of this calamity is the mark of the chaotic creature with the word come. The mark could appear anywhere, and it could also appear in the body of any living being." What he meant was that Duan-Shi might also have the mark of the chaotic creature on him. In other words, he might also be part of the source of this world's calamity. Duan-Shi chuckled and said, "Just wait and see. No matter what I say now, you'll be able to find some flaws if you doubt me." As he spoke, he could not be bothered to care about the peak quasi-saint anymore. He was just preparing for the calamity. The calamity had arrived as scheduled. When the time recorded in the cultivation techniques was up, the world shook slightly as if there was a subtle change. Following that, countless strange natural sceneries appeared all over the world out of nowhere. Following that, many cultivators that looked normal suddenly underwent a drastic change. In the blink of an eye, they were filled with a destructive aura that was not there before. Amidst this destructive aura, their power and aura began to rise crazily. They even began to distort the surrounding space-time and laws, causing the region they were in to gradually change. Not long after, it became a state that was incompatible with the outside world. Following that, roars were heard from all over the world. There were just too many roars, and their voices were just too loud. When they converged together, it made the entire world seem as if it was the end of the world. An extremely desolate and terrifying atmosphere began to spread in the world. At this moment, the world shook. The preparations that the 3,000 cultivators and Duan-Shi had made were triggered. Almost 30% of the living beings that had undergone such changes were taken away by the wave of attacks that they had prepared. However, even though the living beings were taken away, it did not mean that the disaster that they had brought was over. The reality was the exact opposite. They were taken away in a single wave, causing the destruction they had caused to go out of control. It began to spread in all directions, endlessly destroying everything in the world. Whether it was time, space, laws, or even the existence of the world itself, everything was within the scope of this endless destruction. Of course, it did not mean that taking away the living beings was a mistake. After all, those living beings were the source of the chaos and destruction. As long as these living beings existed, no matter how the destruction was restrained or controlled, it would still cause an incomparably great impact in the end. In fact, due to the condensation of their power when they were rampaging, if these living beings didn't die, the destruction they caused would be more than 10 times greater than when they were randomly spreading out. Due to that reason, the 3,000 cultivators, including Duan-Shi, were extremely calm as the destruction spread. They were not affected at all. On the contrary, the other cultivators were in awe of Duan-Shi's decision. One must know that they were only making preparations to deal with those living beings. It was because of Duan-Shi's participation that they were able to spread their preparations to other aspects that might affect the world. Clearly, the changes in the world at this moment proved that their previous preparations were wise. If they hadn't made such preparations, they wouldn't have been helpless in the face of the destruction caused by the death of so many living beings in this world. However, in comparison, it was inevitable that they would be flustered. If they were flustered when the calamity had just arrived, it would definitely trigger a chain reaction. By then, it would become more and more difficult for them to deal with it. In the end, their losses might even increase by several times. Under such circumstances, how could they not be in awe of Duan-Shi's decision? Duan-Shi did not take the admiration of the cultivators to heart. At this time, He kept in mind all the knowledge that Luo Fan had imparted to him. He integrated his body and mind into the various formations, magical abilities, and powers that he was controlling. He did his utmost to fight against the creatures with the marks of the primordial chaos creatures. He did his utmost to prevent them from destroying this world, and he also did his utmost to eliminate them. The calamity this time was extremely fierce. It had only been a few years since the beginning of the calamity to the most intense war. When the tribulation arrived, almost every region in the world was plunged into war. After the calamity was awakened, not only were the feelings of the living beings with the marks of chaos creatures completely wiped out, but their intelligence and strength were also enhanced beyond imagination. As a result, their strength was naturally many times stronger than before. Among them, many of them even broke through the innate Grand Luo realm and stepped into the quasi-saint realm. Moreover, because these living beings possessed the imprints of chaos creatures, the power that they could unleash was many times greater than that of living beings in this world at the same level of strength. With such powerful strength, it went without saying that the destructive power that they could cause was unimaginable. It could be said that even with Duan Shi and the various preparations that the 3,000 cultivators had made, the world was still struggling to hold on. In the end, after spending a few decades, paying the price of half of the world collapsing and nearly 50% to 60% of the living beings dying, the world, or in other words, Duan Shi and the others finally survived the calamity with great difficulty. Finally, all the living beings with the marks of chaos creatures were sent back into the cycle of reincarnation. It's a pity that not only are these marks extremely tough, but they're also protected by the world. It's impossible to destroy them. Otherwise, we could just destroy these marks once and for all. In the end, the peak quasi-saint sighed as the world returned to normal. Upon hearing that, Duan Shi sighed and said, "Isn't it only natural? To the world, the value of these marks is probably more than 100 times greater than all of us combined. How could it allow us to destroy these marks? Moreover, even if we can destroy these marks, it's not enough to solve the problem once and for all. Don't forget that the second calamity of the world is still hanging over our heads in hundreds of millions of years." Duan Shi changed the topic. His words left the peak quasi-saint speechless. After all, he couldn't bring himself to lie through his teeth. Chapter 23:41. The peak sage-to-be asked. Senior Duan Shi said that he came out this time to gain enlightenment from the tribulations. However, Senior Duan Shi has been hiding in the palace during the tribulations. Is this how Senior Duan Shi trains himself? Duan Shi suddenly revealed a smile when he heard the questioning words and said, "As expected, your vision is still limited to such a shallow and direct level." The peak sage-to-be could not help but feel bewildered when he heard Duan Shi's direct denial. The source of these complicated emotions was naturally quite obvious. First of all, he was naturally quite displeased with this kind of behavior of denying his own knowledge. He felt that this was an offense to him, and it was a denial of his own knowledge of cultivation and the world. However, on the other hand, he understood that the person in front of him was an expert who was many times stronger than him. Duan Shi's words might not be nonsense. It was precisely because of these considerations that he became so anxious and doubtful. Cultivation isn't just about fighting. Duan Shi did not say anything else. He ended the topic with this sentence. After all, although his cultivation realm was many times stronger than the peak sage-to-be, it did not mean that he had the obligation to guide the peak sage-to-be. It did not mean that he had to help the peak sage-to-be solve all the doubts that he had. However, such a sentence had already made the pinnacle of the sage-to-be comprehend. He vaguely felt that he had touched the barrier between the sage-to-be realm and the false sage realm. The feeling of breaking through, which he had been trying hard for tens of thousands of years, once again appeared in his heart. Of course, this feeling was extremely weak at this moment. After all, it was just an ordinary sentence. It did not have the ability to send someone into a new realm. At this moment, Duan Shi completely ignored the peak sage-to-be. He stood up and said, "I'll leave the rest to you. We'll meet again if fate allows it." As he spoke, his figure gradually turned blurry and soon disappeared completely as if he had never been there. Only then did the peak quasi-saint react to his departure. He could not help but feel a sense of loss, and vaguely felt an indescribable pressure suddenly pressing down on him. Previously, when Duan Shi was still here, due to Duan Shi's domineering attitude, his authority was greatly affected. Every decision had to be made with his presence in mind, making it difficult for his will to be carried out. Due to that, he hated Duan Shi's existence to the core. He could not wait for Duan Shi to disappear right away. However, when the broken world finally disappeared, he realized that he was at a loss without the broken world. The power that he had grasped in his hands before the appearance of the broken era suddenly became heavy. Many of the things that he had planned out well suddenly became specious. The various plans and arrangements that he had made were no longer that carefree feeling. Instead, it was an indescribable pressure. It was as if this world was completely different from the world that he controlled in the past. How did it become like this? The peak quasi-saint had deep control over his mind, so he understood the changes as soon as they appeared. He could not help but feel puzzled. He turned to look at the remaining cultivators below and saw an indescribable sense of loss in the depths of their eyes. It was as if they had suddenly lost some central support. So, we've unknowingly developed a dependence on Duan Shi. The peak quasi-saint could not help but smile bitterly as he understood the source of all these changes. As he sighed, he did his best to focus his mind. He tried his best to cut off the dependence he had on Airbreaker for helping the world through the calamity. Fortunately, he was already at the pinnacle of the sage-to-be. He was not an ordinary cultivator, nor was he an ordinary living being. Although it was difficult at this moment, he still managed to achieve this step. He had completely severed his dependence and regained his clarity of mind. At the same time, he felt that the authority that had returned to his hands had become comfortable. After that, he said to the crowd, "Everything will return to the right track. For the sake of all living beings in the world, and for ourselves, we need to help the world recover its vitality as soon as possible. The next calamity isn't far away." His words contained a subtle fluctuation that directly entered the ears of the cultivators in the hall and spread into their bodies, causing the power within them to tremble subtly. The cultivators were shocked when they heard this. For a moment, their minds suddenly became clear, as if some kind of power had swept away the fog in their minds, allowing them to suddenly wake up. After all, the peak quasi-saint was only one step away from reaching the pseudo-sage realm. In the eyes of Duan Shi and in the eyes of Luo Fan, he was insignificant. However, compared to the other living beings and cultivators in the world, he was still an unimaginable colossus. His power, his strength, and his willpower were absolute when compared to other cultivators. Just now, he used his will and voice to influence the minds of the cultivators, temporarily freeing them from the chaotic state of mind caused by the departure of the existence they relied on. After the minds of the cultivators became clear again, they all noticed the abnormality in themselves, and they all sucked in a breath of cold air. They were extremely grateful to the peak quasi-saint who had woken them up. After that, there was a series of arrangements for the world. After leaving the hall, Duan Shi turned into an ordinary living being and entered the world to travel. To him, this kind of travel was even more important than the effort he put in during the calamity. In other words, it was more beneficial to him. Amidst the tribulation, he had truly sensed all sorts of feelings and impacts from the battle between all living beings and the living beings that carried the mark of primal chaos. He had also absorbed some of the nutrients that he needed to improve his cultivation. However, it was only one-sided. Cultivation was not only about battles and confrontations. At this very moment, everything that he had experienced as he roamed the world encompassed all aspects of cultivation. Only then was it able to affect him in all aspects. Tens of thousands of years passed in the blink of an eye. In these tens of thousands of years, Duan Shi had almost personally witnessed the world prosper from the state of ruins. He had personally witnessed the originally barren land being filled with the creation of living beings again. He had personally witnessed the originally empty world being filled with the endless aura of living beings again. All of this was so natural, but it allowed his cultivation realm to naturally break through. From the false saint that could only be placed in the hall where Luo Fan was, he had broken through to a false saint that could exist independently and be placed in his own existence. This kind of breakthrough seemed to be just a small step, but it was actually extremely important. If it was before, he, who was shackled to a world or a hall, would not be able to unleash the power of a false saint even if he had the realm of a false saint. In fact, even his own life was being dragged down by the existence of the palace itself. Once there was any problem with the hall or even if it was destroyed, he would also face problems and even die. Now that he had transcended this shackle and turned the foundation of the false saint from the original hall to himself, the situation was obviously completely different. Now, no matter where he was, he would be able to unleash the power of a false saint. He could easily suppress all false saints, regardless of whether they were peak rank 9 false saints or cultivators who were false saints but had left the world they resided in. I've finally broken through the shackle. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the hall, murmured. At this moment, he could clearly feel that Duan Shi, who was floating in the sky, was emitting a brilliance that had not been there before. It was a brilliance that belonged only to him, different from this world, different from the true saint who resonated with him. Under the illumination of this brilliance, he became so transparent like a beautiful piece of jade. He gave off an incomparably shocking feeling, even causing the entire world to tremble slightly. At this moment, tribulation clouds were brewing in the void with difficulty. The reason why it was difficult was because the tribulation clouds seemed to have some scruples, or rather, some hesitation. It was as if Duan Shi's breakthrough was between the recognition and rejection of this world. Duan Shi floated in the void with a blank and empty expression, as if he was immersed in an indescribable mysterious realm. After a while, he came back to his senses and looked up at the tribulation clouds that were about to condense. Suddenly, an indescribable anger surged in his heart. Immediately afterward, he raised his hand and grabbed at the void. Boundless terrifying power instantly covered the sky within a radius of hundreds of thousands of kilometers. With a slight tremble, the sky within a radius of hundreds of thousands of kilometers suddenly collapsed. All of the space, time, and even the laws and rules that existed behind it collapsed at this moment, turning into countless smoke-like fragments that constantly stirred in the void. At this moment, the entire world began to tremble slightly. An indescribable fear appeared in everyone's hearts at this moment, causing the entire world to fall into an indescribable state of silence. It was as if everything in the world had disappeared, leaving only the supreme existence that was floating in the sky and using an extremely powerful force to shake the world and destroy time and space. I've finally woken up. Let's see how many fragments I can retrieve this time. At this moment, Luo Fan felt an inexplicable anticipation in his heart in the palace that was in between reality and illusion. At this moment, he had retrieved more than 90% of the fragments in this world. He was only 5 or 6% away from the true perfection. However, it was this 5 or 6% that prevented him from achieving perfection in this world. Now, he did not even dare to leave this place that was in between reality and illusion. After all, there were still some fragments that were controlled by the world. No matter how powerful Luo Fan was, he would not be able to escape from it no matter how powerful he was. The heaven and earth didn't need to care about any of his method. It only needed to use the fragments that he controlled as a guide to easily reach his origin and completely crush the more than 90% of the fragments that he had gathered with great difficulty. Then, he would once again return to the state of absolute powder. If that was not the case with Luo Fan's strength, even if he could not fight against this world and the great calamity that was triggered by it, it would not be difficult for him to completely conceal himself so that the world would not be able to detect his existence and distinguish him from other living beings. Why would he need to hide in between reality and illusion like this? Just as Luo Fan was thinking about this, in the outside world, Duan Ji's method had clearly angered the world. In an instant, the tribulation clouds that had been completely annihilated along with the surrounding space-time began to gather at a crazy speed. As they gathered, the shattered space-time and the shattered rules and laws recovered. They directly formed a space-time that was exactly the same as before and completely enveloped him. At this moment, Duan Ji felt an indescribable pressure acting on his soul. It was as if the entire world was rejecting him all of a sudden, as if all the forces in the world were targeting him, trying to drive him away, trying to destroy him. Come on. I'll take whatever you have to do. I'm no longer your puppet. Duan Ji roared angrily. Amidst these words, the tribulation clouds in the sky began to condense frantically. The originally pitch-black clouds suddenly seemed to transform into an incomparably huge black hole. It was as if all gazes and light were completely sucked in. Anyone who looked at it could only feel that the sky seemed to have become a huge emptiness, crack. Following that, a deafening sound came from the ground. The entire world seemed to tremble slightly. This is the vibration coming from the tribulation clouds. However, due to the strangeness of the tribulation clouds, the sound that should have appeared did not appear at all. Instead, it was the resonance of the ground caused by the vibration that produced this sound. Even in the midst of his anger, Duan Ji instinctively guessed the reason for this strange change. Right at this moment, a palm descended from the sky, pressing down on him at a seemingly slow but actually fast speed. The palm was over 10,000 zhang in size. Even though it was formed from energy, it was so solid that it felt like a real body made of flesh and blood. There was even an unimaginably terrifying blood qi being emitted from it in the air, causing Duan Shi's heartbeat to be affected, causing him to feel a subtle sense of chaos. Chapter 23:42. Although he had such thoughts, it was impossible for Duan Shi to just watch as the palm completely erased him. After all, he was already a false saint who had broken free from his shackles. As a false saint, he represented omnipotence, omniscience, and omniscience. After breaking free from his shackles, he had transferred his residence from a certain world or spacetime in the outside world to his own body, or the world or spacetime in his body. Although this would slightly weaken the strength he could exert in the outside world, he was unable to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient. However, a false saint was still a false saint after all. Even if he could not achieve that, he was definitely not someone a false saint could compare to. At this moment, he made up his mind and unleashed the power around him. It directly shook spacetime, causing the surrounding spacetime and laws to distort into countless unbelievable shapes. Accompanied by an endless brilliance, a huge palm was formed and blasted toward the sky, forcefully colliding with the palm descending from the tribulation clouds. Crack! This time, the terrifying explosion even caused the entire world to tremble. Everyone could sense the changes that were taking place due to the intense yet subtle trembling and shaking. All living beings understood that the world might undergo a huge change from today onwards. The power contained in the palm descending from the sky was so terrifying that it could destroy the world. However, the power that Duan Shi had gathered was not weak either. It contained the terrifying power of the world and space-time. As they collided, neither was able to suppress the other. In the end, the two were annihilated at the same time, turning into countless shock waves that spread in all directions. The shock waves completely shattered the surrounding space-time and laws, causing a strange vacuum to appear. It seemed like this place was completely independent from the outside world. Duan sure hovered there in the face of such a change. The power around him surged as he tried his best to adjust the power in his body. An aura that transcended everything gradually leaked out. No matter how chaotic the surroundings were, no matter how empty the vacuum was, it could not stop the aura at all at this time. In the place between reality and illusion, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. His heart moved, and from the void where Duan Jie was undergoing his tribulation, there was an incomparably small existence that directly penetrated through space-time and entered the palace that was between reality and illusion. It directly penetrated the universe and entered his body. These were none other than the fragments of his soul. At this moment, although the number of fragments was not small, it was still insignificant compared to the number of fragments that he had yet to retrieve. It was not even enough to make his completion percentage jump to a noticeable number. But even so, this change was enough to make him feel pleasantly surprised. Because this was only the beginning of the tribulation. For Duan Shiji, surviving the previous attack was just the beginning of his tribulation. What awaited him next would be endless attacks with no end in sight. If every attack was like this, allowing him to retrieve a fragment, then it would only be a matter of time before his fragment reached perfection in this world. This obviously meant that his deduction earlier was indeed correct. The upheaval in front of him was indeed enough for him to achieve perfection once again. How could he not be excited? At this moment, the black hole-like tribulation clouds above the broken world changed once again. Another palm descended from the sky. However, this time, the palm was no longer just slapping down. It came crashing down from above. Instead, he clenched his fist and swung it down from the sky like a gigantic meteor, smashing down on Duan Shiji. It was as if this punch was going to shatter the heavens and earth and destroy the world. It was filled with the determination to destroy the heavens and earth. The space that was affected by this punch naturally turned into countless destroyed heavens and earth, time and space. After it appeared, it kept stirring, bringing with it a boundlessly terrifying momentum as it pressed down on Duan Jiesher. In the face of such an attack, Duansher's third eye flickered with divine light. Divine abilities soared into the sky and formed countless mysterious forms in the void. Like thousands of magic treasures, they converged into a river and rushed towards the fist, colliding with it once again. Rumble, 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 an endless series of explosions came from the point where the river and the fist collided. The river swallowed the fist in an instant, crushing and destroying the countless destroyed spacetimes around the fist. All the auras and energy within were completely eliminated and erased. Chi-chi-chi-chi, countless strange sounds came from the point where the fist and the river collided. A powerful impact spread in all directions, and all kinds of distorted shock waves and space-time flashed crazily at this moment. In the end, the fist broke through the river of divine abilities. Although it had shrunk by many times, a part of its power still fell on Duan Shiji's body and smashed into his body. Billions of terrifying explosions came from his body in an instant, and endless shock waves spread in all directions. Duan Shiji let out a muffled groan, and the power in his body surged crazily. Boundless spiritual light shone continuously. After his body collapsed, it immediately condensed and returned to its original appearance. It looked as if nothing had happened and he had not encountered any attack. However, this was of course only on the surface. In fact, compared to before, his aura was a little weaker, as if he had consumed some kind of source. What a powerful attack, but it's definitely not the trace of a true divine. If it was a true divine, I wouldn't have been able to block it so easily. At this moment, Duan Shiji raised his head and looked at the sky with an indescribable confidence in his three eyes. What did the existence of a true divine mean? In this world, apart from Luo Fan, he was probably the one who understood it the best. After all, He had received the resonance of the trace left behind by a true divine in his previous life. Just thinking about the boundless information and comprehension that were transmitted to him in an instant was enough to make him indescribably shocked. Not to mention, before he was born in this life, he was also in the trace left behind by a true divine. If it wasn't for Luo Fan who saved him, he might have fallen into the fate of his previous life again. In this case, how could he not understand the power of any trace left behind by a true divine? It could be said that if the palm and the fist were the traces left behind by a true divine, he would not be able to dodge two waves. Even the fluctuation of the aura produced by the first wave would be enough to easily wipe him out. Because of this, he had absolute confidence that the palm and the fist were not the traces left behind by a true divine. Since they were not the traces left behind by a true divine, just the image and the traces formed by the tribulations were already so powerful that he had to run for his life and use his source to barely block it. In that case, it was almost self-evident what the source of the fist and the palm was. As expected, it can only be teacher. He smiled bitterly as he looked at the black hole-like tribulation clouds above him. He could faintly see an incomparably vast, incomparably familiar figure floating there with a faint smile on his face. At this moment, Luo Fan had already gathered the fragments that belonged to him in the fist and condensed them into his body. This time, the number of fragments condensed was a little more than the previous time. Finally, he could feel that the percentage of fragments he had condensed was a little wriggling. At this speed, I should be able to completely condense all the fragments after 100,000 attacks, Luo Fan thought quietly as a look of anticipation appeared on his face. 100,000 attacks was naturally an attack that could make ordinary cultivators feel despair. However, for a pseudo-saint like Duanji, it was not unbelievable for 100,000 attacks to be gathered in a single tribulation. In fact, it could even be said to be inevitable. If there were not more than 100,000 attacks in a single tribulation, it could only be regarded as a test of the world, or even a process. Therefore, at this moment, after recognizing that he needed 100,000 attacks to repair all the fragments, Luo Fan was not discouraged at all. Instead, he was secretly delighted. He was quite confident that he could truly turn the fragments of this world into perfection this time. While Luo Fan was secretly happy about the appearance of this tribulation, Duanji fell into an unimaginable torment on the other side. The black hole-like retribution cloud in the sky kept coming down, attacking again and again. Some of these attacks were like palms, fists, fingers, feet, elbows, and knees. Some were like all kinds of weapons, natural sceneries, magical treasures, and mystic abilities. They were endless and unceasing, bombarding down on the world breaker. Every single attack was a struggle between life and death for Duanshi. Although he managed to block the attacks one after another and deal with the attacks from the retribution cloud again and again, the price he paid was rather heavy. At the very least, his origin, the space-time in his body, his comprehension, and everything else were being worn down by the repeated confrontations. In just a few days, he felt as if he had been tortured for hundreds of millions of years. His entire body was emitting a dispirited and dispirited aura. It could be said that the reason why he was still floating in the air was because of his unyielding will. How many attacks have I endured? 10,000, 100,000, or 1,000,000? Looking at the retribution cloud in the sky that was no different from a few days ago, such a thought flashed through Duanji's mind. He vaguely felt an inexplicable sense of despair. This despair instantly caused his aura to change, making him seem even more dispirited and powerless. It's only 30,000 attacks and he's already powerless? At this moment, in the palace that was in between reality and illusion, Luo Fan sighed inwardly. Duanji couldn't clearly calculate how many attacks he had endured because of the terrifying attack. However, he was able to clearly calculate each attack after collecting the fragments left behind by the attack. From the beginning until now, Duan-ji had only suffered a total of 30,000 attacks. Compared to his original plan of 100,000 attacks, it wasn't even a third of it. This made Luo Fan finally understand that he might have overestimated Duan-ji. Perhaps he still needed a long period of time to enrich himself before he could truly achieve his goal of breaking through the heavens and earth and using the traces he left behind to launch 100,000 attacks, allowing him to reassemble all his fragments and restore himself to his perfect state in the heavens and earth. However, this opportunity was quite rare. If he waited until the next time the heavens and earth triggered the heavenly realm to attack him, the situation would most likely be different. It wouldn't be as easy and smooth for him to reassemble his fragments. Various thoughts flashed through his mind. In the end, Luo Fan let out a sigh. It seems like I can only take the risk and make a move. This thought appeared in his mind, suppressing all other thoughts. Then, with a slight thought, an indescribable wave directly penetrated the barrier between reality and illusion, arrived at Duan-ji's location, and directly poured into Duan-ji's heart. The appearance of the wave instantly made Duan-ji's expression change. The energy around him surged wildly in an attempt to get rid of the wave. Obviously, he'd taken this fluctuation to be another attack from the heavenly tribulation. However, he didn't realize that the wave actually came from Luo Fan, his teacher. Naturally, Luo Fan had expected this kind of resistance. At this moment, he controlled the wave to carry out all kinds of extremely subtle and mysterious changes, easily bypassing all of Duan-ji's resistance. All of the attacks directly penetrated his soul and instantly connected with his soul. The moment the wave connected with his soul, Luo Fan felt an indescribable despair transmitted through Duan-ji's soul. Obviously, Duan-ji couldn't resist the wave and thought that there was no chance for him to survive, hence the indescribable despair. In the midst of this despair, Luo Fan also felt an indescribable sense of guilt and regret. The guilt seemed to be directed at him, and the regret seemed to be directed at him too. Guilt? Regret? Can I know why you're feeling guilty and regretful toward me? At this moment, Luo Fan smiled and transmitted his words through the wave. Chapter 23:43. Something wasn't right. Wasn't this the inner demon attack formed by the heavenly tribulation? Why would it react in such a strange way? However, Duan sure wasn't an ordinary person. He reacted quickly and understood what was going on. An indescribable sense of shame welled up in his heart. He said, "This disciple is incompetent and has failed to live up to Master's expectations. I feel guilty because of this. However, it's a pity that I can no longer listen to Master's teachings." Luo Fan smiled faintly when he heard that. He said, "So it's because of this. There's no need for that. Your imprint is extremely strong. Even if you die this time, you can continue to reincarnate. I will still be able to find you in the future. There's no need to feel guilty or regret." Duan sure smiled bitterly when he heard that. It might be the same for Luo Fan, but it was completely different for him. After reincarnating, he would become another person. He would no longer be himself. It was just like how he didn't think that he was the great emperor in his previous life. Of course, there was no need to say that out loud. Whether it was Luo Fan or him, they both knew this very well. Luo Fan didn't wait for Duan Shi to refute him. After saying that, he said, "The heavenly tribulation is both a calamity and an opportunity. You're making a big mistake by treating it as a calamity." As he spoke, he began to explain the various mysteries of the heavenly tribulation to Duan Shi. As he explained, Duan Shi was suddenly enlightened. Then, he felt remorseful. Suddenly, he became excited. In a trance, he felt enlightened. The fog that was covering his reality seemed to have disappeared in the blink of an eye. After explaining everything that Duan Shi needed to know about the heavenly tribulation, Luo Fan didn't stay any longer. With a slight thought, the fluctuation completely disappeared. He didn't even say his final farewell to Duan Shi. The reason for that wasn't because he was too lazy to say anything. It was because he didn't have the right to say a single word at this time. That was because the black hole-like tribulation cloud in the sky had already begun to sense his existence. Grasping the frequency of the fluctuations, it was about to follow the fluctuations to find him, who was in between reality and illusion, and directly transmit its attack to him. Under such circumstances, how could he continue to maintain this fluctuation? One must know that the heavenly tribulation he had encountered during the broken arrow was nothing to him. However, this heavenly tribulation was caused by the heavens and earth. Naturally, it would adjust itself according to the existence it was targeting. For Dwanshur, the power of the heavenly tribulation was only at this level. However, if it were to extend into the palace, the power of the heavenly tribulation would no longer be at this level. It might even be possible for it to increase by tens of millions of times, or even billions of times. At that time, perhaps he would be able to resist it, but he would definitely have to pay an extremely great price. Luo Fan did not have the luxury to pay such a price for some nonsense. At this moment, Dwanshur seemed to have sensed something. His heart was filled with gratitude towards Luo Fan. Teacher has taken such a huge risk to guide me. I must definitely work hard to get through this tribulation, so as to not let teacher down. Such thoughts flashed through his mind. His expression turned solemn, and the brilliance on his body surged. It suddenly turned into countless lightning bolts that formed a mysterious world around him. At this moment, an indescribable force blasted down from the black hole-like tribulation clouds. It directly smashed into the world formed by the lightning, causing the world and the force to collapse at the same time. However, shortly after, the world formed by the lightning spun and suddenly sucked in the energy that came crashing down from the tribulation cloud. It fused with the countless energy, and with another spin, it formed the shape of the world once again. It continued to appear around his body, and continued to protect his body. Moreover, the world formed by the lightning seemed to be more solid and larger than before. The various laws within it seemed to be more complete. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the palace between reality and illusion, had a gratified smile on his face. Countless tiny fragments simultaneously traversed through a strange channel and appeared in his palace before fusing into his body. It was obvious that after destroying the power of the heavenly tribulation, Luo Fan had once again absorbed the fragments that he had split up. After all, the power seemed to have been condensed into a ball and thrown down, but the truth was that its internal structure contained endless profound mysteries. Even the trajectory of its descent contained endless principles. These naturally contained the mysteries of a cultivation method. Of course, it also included the fragments of Luo Fan that had turned into abstract attributes of the cultivation method. Just now, when this power was crushed and devoured, those abstract attributes were naturally able to break away and then be absorbed by Luo Fan. However, this kind of absorption was much weaker than the heavenly tribulation's method of directly using the traces left behind by Luo Fan to create an attack. After all, if the attack was condensed using the traces left behind by Luo Fan, it would naturally be able to attract more fragments into the attack since it was already resonating with Luo Fan's fragment. Once the attack was shattered, Luo Fan would naturally be able to retrieve more fragments. However, no matter how many fragments there were, as long as the attack continued, Luo Fan would naturally be able to continuously retrieve his fragments. If this continued, he would eventually be able to collect all of his fragments. After receiving Luo Fan's guidance, Duan Shiji's method of dealing with the heavenly tribulation had changed. Currently, he was no longer purely dealing with the attack triggered by the heavenly tribulation. Instead, he had constructed various methods to absorb the power of the heavenly tribulation to strengthen his own method. He had even comprehended the various mysteries and principles within the heavenly tribulation. He had integrated the mysteries and principles into his body and mind to deepen his understanding of cultivation and raise his cultivation realm. As a result, it became easier for him to deal with the heavenly tribulation. In the beginning, it was still bumpy. Almost every time, he had to pay a considerable price to endure it. However, as time passed, the price he had to pay became less and less. In the end, he did not even have to pay any price at all. Just the defense he built by absorbing the power of the heavenly realm was enough to completely block the heavenly tribulation's attack and even devour it. As a result, Luo Fan, who was in between reality and illusion, naturally obtained more and more benefits. The number of fragments he absorbed also increased, and the entire absorption process became smoother. Time passed second by second during this process. As time passed, the power of the heavenly tribulation also strengthened bit by bit. Unknowingly, another few days had passed. Over the past few days, the entire world had been shaking even more intensely than before. All kinds of tremors appeared in this world at a faster speed than before, and they were constantly transmitted to the senses of all living beings. As the changes intensified, more and more cultivators began to search for the source of the changes. There were so many cultivators in this world, so they naturally had all kinds of strange methods. As a result, even if this location became difficult to find due to the distortion of the heavenly tribulation's power, it would still be discovered by some cultivators. As more and more cultivators learned about it, it would eventually become an open secret. As a result, there were naturally more courageous people who came to this area and began to observe the changes. They wanted to find the source of the turbulence and why it was happening. Under these circumstances, after a few days, there were countless cultivators around this heavenly realm. They were outside this area and used various methods to observe everything, wanting to find out the truth of everything. Among them, some of the methods were too violent or, in other words, more brilliant and actually triggered the heavenly tribulation. In the end, they were affected by the aftermath of the heavenly tribulation, and in the end, they were killed by the heavenly tribulation. This change made many cultivators even more curious about what was going on. This was also because the situation in this world had been too peaceful over the past tens of thousands of years. If this happened during the heavenly tribulation, this kind of change would probably cause great panic. Everyone would wonder if this was the start of another heavenly tribulation. At this moment, in the depths of space and time, in the palace that was the ruler of this world, an intense argument broke out. This was the first time this kind of argument had happened since the alliance of the 3,000 cultivators was formed. In the past, even if they disagreed with each other, the cultivators could still restrain themselves from understanding each other and use gentle methods to resolve their differences. This way, there was naturally no need for this kind of argument. However, the situation this time was clearly completely different. This time, the disagreement between the 3,000 cultivators was simply too great. It had even reached a point where it was completely opposite, and it was no longer something that gentle discussions could resolve. In fact, it could even be said that they were only quarreling and not killing each other. This could already be said to be extremely restrained. The thing they were arguing about was none other than how they should deal with Duan Shiji, who was undergoing the heavenly tribulation. One side wanted to help heaven and earth to destroy Duan Shiji completely. The other side wanted to help Duan Shiji overcome the heavenly tribulation. The reason for these two different approaches was very simple. For the cultivators who wanted to help heaven and earth, they believed that Duan Shiji's existence had already affected the balance of this world. He had already caused a riot in this world. If this continued, the next heavenly tribulation would most likely be triggered in advance. It was even possible that several heavenly tribulations would occur at the same time, and in the end, heaven and earth would suffer a disaster. For the cultivators that lived in this world, it was needless to say what choice they should make. For the cultivators who wanted to help Duan Shiji overcome the heavenly tribulation, the reason was not difficult to understand. It was because they believed that since Duan Shiji could affect the balance of this world and cause such a heavenly tribulation to appear to deal with him, It was obvious that he had obtained something that even heaven and earth would be afraid of. If he could help them and wholeheartedly help others overcome the heavenly tribulation, then the continuous heavenly tribulation would not be a problem. Perhaps they could even end the endless heavenly tribulation in advance. These two completely different attitudes could not be reconciled. It was either this or that, and they could not coexist. Because of this, they fell into such a quarrel. As the strongest expert among the 3,000 cultivators, the pinnacle of the sage-to-be was having a headache. He did not participate in the quarrel. Instead, he stood in the middle and hesitated along with a few other cultivators. It was obvious that it was difficult for him to decide what to do with Duan Shiji. In other words, he felt that the attitudes of both sides were reasonable. The quarrel between the 3,000 cultivators became more and more intense. In the end, they could not hold back their power anymore. All sorts of auras were released from their bodies and gradually stirred up the space-time in the hall, causing the hall to be filled with hurricanes. Seeing that they were going to start killing each other regardless of the consequences, the peak quasi-sage knew that he could not allow them to continue like this. If he allowed them to continue like this, the alliance would break apart before they could decide on how to deal with Duan Shiji and the heavenly tribulation. Once this alliance broke apart, it would be a calamity for the entire world. Under such circumstances, he no longer hesitated and directly unleashed his powerful aura. With a sweep of it, all the auras in the entire palace were swept away. The various fluctuations, conflicts, and chaos that were produced by the auras were instantly suppressed, causing the palace to return to its previous tranquil state, as if nothing had happened. Stop. Do you want to erase all your previous efforts for such a trivial matter? The pinnacle quasi-sage shouted coldly. His voice swept through the hall like a piercingly cold wind, invading the minds of all the cultivators in the hall. All of them suddenly woke up from their agitation and showed an indescribable expression of shame. All of a sudden, they realized what they had been doing just now. The cultivators immediately lowered their heads and did not dare to say a word. There's no need to discuss this anymore. We're not going to do anything. If Senior Duan Shiji can survive the heavenly tribulation, it means that he's capable. If he can't, it means that he's useless. We just need to prepare for the next heavenly tribulation, the peak quasi-sage said after taking a deep breath. Hearing this, everyone's faces were filled with dissatisfaction.